He takes a pinch of soil. He rubs it between his fingers. He sniffs it, and his heart sinks. Pure silt. No structure, no life. For hundreds of years, someone has been taking everything from this land and giving nothing back. The locals consider it cursed. But the man trapped in the body of a 16-year-old boy knows the truth. The soil isn't cursed. The soil is poisoned. And he's the only one in this world who knows how to restore it. Now let's rewind. The first thing he senses is a smell. Goat droppings. Rotten wood. Something sour like soil after acid rain. He opens his eyes. Above him is a ceiling of blackened beams. Straw pricks his back through his thin shirt. He raises his hand to his face and freezes. It's not his hand. Thin, dirty fingers. Someone else's. Two memories flood his mind at once, like two radio channels on the same frequency. One insists that his name is Dane, 16 years old. Today, he was brought to the temple where the goddess of the harvest was supposed to grant him the class. She didn't. The second memory insists that he is Dan Hayes, 34 years old, a master's degree in agronomy from Iowa. And the last thing he remembers is ice under his boot and the back of his head hitting the concrete. He sits down. His head sways. His body is light and weak, like that of a newly hatched chick. A goat bleats behind the wall. Dan stands up. His legs give way. He grabs hold of a post and immediately feels soft rot beneath his palm. Another year and the roof will collapse. The agronomist's mind calculates this automatically. He pushes open the door and sees the ground. Gray, flat as far as the eye can see. No grass, no greenery, just a cracked crust like the bottom of a dried-up pond. And then he bends down and picks up that very pinch. Dane's memory suggests a word. Nameless. One to whom the goddess granted no class. Not a knight, not a mage, not a healer. Nobody. Here, people like that are sent to dig the earth until they die. The average age is 32. And right here, something pulls him, like a magnet beneath his ribs. He looks at the shed where, as far as Dane can recall, there's nothing but junk. But his legs carry him there of their own accord. He moves the stone aside. He steps inside. Light streams through a hole in the roof, falling directly onto a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas. Dan unties the rope. Inside are 4 items. A hoe, a sickle whose blade doesn't gleam but seems to swallow the light. A clay watering can with a pattern that turns out to be text in an unknown language. And a small hand plow with a plowshare the color of old bone. He touches the hoe's handle and his fingers grow warm. They aren't burning. They're warm. Like a cup of coffee on a winter morning. The hoe fits into his palm as if it were carved for it, and it weighs nothing. Dan stands and looks at the 4 tools that have lain here for 800 years, wrapped in a rag. He doesn't know what they are. He doesn't know why they respond to his touch. But he knows one thing. These are tools for working the earth, and the earth outside is dying, and he is the only person in this world who understands why. He steps outside and walks down to the stream at the foot of the hill. The water is murky with a reddish tinge. He sniffs it. Iron. Lots of iron. The stream carries dissolved salts from the iron ore deposits upstream. That's why the strip of land by the water is deader than the rest. Excess iron blocks phosphorus uptake. Nothing will grow here, no matter how hard you try. The locals call this land cursed. Dan smirks. Not cursed. Poisoned and without drainage. Classic. He's seen this in South Dakota. Divert the iron-rich water, rework the topsoil, add organic matter, and choose a crop that tolerates residual iron. Turnips. Turnips love iron. They pull it out of the soil and store it in their roots. He goes to find the village headman. Orrin is sitting on a log in the yard of the village's largest house. His face is gray. His eyes are red. A wet cough drifts out of the house. Steady. Hopeless. Dane's memory prompts him. The village headman's daughter, Lena. 17 years old. She's had gray fever for a month now. The priests came twice and threw up their hands. The will of the goddess. Dan sits down next to him and asks for that patch of land by the stream where nothing has ever grown. The village headman looks at him as if he were crazy. Then he waves his hand. Take it. It belongs to no one anyway. Dan stands up. And then, once again, that cough from the house. Quiet. Spent. It stops. He looks at the house. He looks at the stream. He looks at the hoe in his hand, and he makes up his mind. He won't just grow a turnip. He'll grow something that will save this girl. Because, according to the description, Gray fever is severe anemia complicated by poisoning from bad water. And a turnip grown in this soil will absorb so much iron that it will work just as well as a pharmacy-grade remedy. Theory. But a theory backed by 20 years of knowledge. He goes to the plot and does what he's always done. He walks. Step by step. He feels the earth beneath his feet. He takes samples every 10 meters. He sniffs them. He crumbles them between his fingers. Clay. Heavy. Saturated with iron. Water pools on the surface and won't drain away. The roots are suffocating here. He needs to loosen the soil half a meter deep. Drainage from below. Organic matter on top. Goat manure. Ash. Leaves. He walks until sunset. 4 hours. Every meter. Now he knows this field. Every weakness. Every opportunity. He pulls out the plow. Sets the plowshare. Pushes. And the plow moves on its own. Like a knife through butter. Not because it's magic, but because Dan knows exactly how deep to cut and at what angle. The clay loosens. The heavy layers slide downward. The light ones rise upward. In an hour, 20 square meters have been plowed. Dan stands knee-deep in the furrow, gasping for air. A teenager's body isn't used to this. But the earth beneath his feet smells different. Not sour and dead. Alive. He smiles. For the first time in this crazy day. The next morning he begs old woman Martha for 3 handfuls of turnips. She gives them to him for free because she considers them useless. No one has planted turnips here for 10 years. They don't grow. Dan digs furrows. He scatters the seeds. He picks up the watering can. He scoops up that same reddish, murky water from the stream. And when it flows from the spout onto the ground, it's different. Clear. Pure. It smells like rain. The watering can doesn't filter the water. It transforms it, turning it into exactly what the plant needs right now. A young turnip needs a neutral pH and traces of potassium. The watering can provides exactly that. He waters slowly, every single seed. Then he collapses onto the straw and falls asleep instantly. He wakes up at dawn and runs to the plot, and freezes in place. Sprouts. Thin green sprouts from every furrow. Overnight, the turnips sprout on the 5th day. 12 hours have passed here. He touches a sprout. Strong, healthy. It's working. The tools are working. On the 2nd day, the sprouts are knee-high. On the 3rd, white tops the size of a fist are poking out of the ground. On the 4th, Dan digs up the first turnip. As big as a child's head. White with a purple tinge. He cuts it open with a knife. The flesh is firm and juicy, with a golden core. He tastes it. Sweet. And a metallic aftertaste lingers on his tongue. Iron. Just what he needs. On the 7th day, he boils the turnip. He makes mashed turnip with goat's milk. He takes to the village headman's house. The coughing in the house has grown quieter. Not because she's getting better. Because the girl no longer has the strength to cough. Dan places a bowl in front of Oren. This is for Lena. It's high in iron. It'll help. The village headman looks at the bowl. At Dan. His eyes show distrust and despair. Despair wins out. He carries the bowl inside. Half an hour later, he comes out. His daughter has eaten half of it. It's the first meal in 3 days that she hasn't spit out. The next morning, Oren comes to the plot himself. He stands at the edge and looks at the green rows in the middle of the gray, barren land. Lena slept peacefully that night. For the first time in a month. Her fever had broken. Her cough had subsided. What did you do? Dan straightens his back. The soil by the stream is rich in iron. Your daughter was lacking it in her blood. The bad water was poisoning her. I grew a turnip that drew from the soil exactly what your daughter needed to eat. The village elder stares at it for a long time. Then he says it's a miracle. Dan returns to the furrow. It's a turnip. It's just that no one knew how to grow it properly before. By the end of the 2nd week, Lena gets out of bed. Thin as a reed, pale, but alive. She steps out onto the porch. She sees the green field. She walks over there. She finds Dan on all fours in the mud. She stands over him and says nothing. Dan lifts his head. 3 days ago, this girl couldn't even sit up. And in her eyes, which are far too big, he recognizes stubbornness. The very same stubbornness with which he himself had clung to every experiment in every field. She says she wants to help. Dan looks at her, at the field. He pulls out a scrap of paper and a stub of a charcoal pencil. He hands them to her. He needs someone to keep records. What's been planted, when it's watered, how it's growing. He can't manage without this. Lena takes the paper. Her fingers are trembling, but she grips the pencil and nods. By the third week, Dan realized that one plot wasn't enough. The turnips fed Lena and the village elder, Orrin. The rest of the village watched from behind their fences. Some with envy, some with fear, some with that look Dan remembered well from Iowa. The look of a farmer who doesn't believe his neighbor succeeded. Because if the neighbor succeeded, it means you yourself did something wrong. And that's unbearable. Thomas was the first to arrive. A lean, wiry man in his 40s with a clearly angry face. Thomas had a plot of land north of the village, 1.5 acres on which he planted barley every year and harvested only a handful of scrawny ears of grain. Thomas didn't come to ask for help. He came to accuse. He stood at the edge of Dan's field and said loudly that the boy must be stealing water from the shared stream, that his turnips were cursed, that normal people don't grow crops like that. Dan listened, standing knee-deep in his garden bed. Then he asked if he could take a look at Thomas's field. Thomas was taken aback. He asked why. Dan said he wanted to understand why the barley wasn't growing. Maybe it wasn't witchcraft but the soil, Thomas snorted. But he led the way. Thomas's field was exactly as Dan had expected. Dead. A gray crust on top. Beneath it, compacted clay without a single drainage channel. The barley poked up with thin, yellow stalks. The roots spread sideways instead of downward because they couldn't break through the surface. Dan crouched down. He scooped up some soil. He rubbed it between his fingers. He shook his head. He told Thomas that his field wasn't dead. It was just tired. That he'd been planting the same crop in the same spot for 20 years. The barley had sucked all the nitrogen out of the topsoil and was now growing in pure dust. Thomas looked at him as if he were a talking dog. Dan continued. He said they needed to divide the field into 3 parts. Plant barley on one, beans on the second, nothing on the third. Just let it rest. Switch them around in a year. The beans will return nitrogen to the soil. The empty strip will restore the soil structure. In 3 years, the field will yield 3 times as much. Thomas asked what kind of beans. Dan replied, any kind, peas, lentils, whatever you have. Thomas said he didn't have any pea seeds. Dan said he'd give him some. Old Martha had a sack of last year's peas that she'd been saving for soup. Dan proposed a trade. Peas for a sack of goat manure. Martha agreed. For the next 3 days, Dan worked Thomas's field with a plow. It was harder work than the plot by the stream. The soil here was different, and the plow required more effort. Every morning, Dan woke up with aching muscles and a headache. The tools worked better once he understood the soil, but that understanding came through hard work. After hours of walking, after dozens of attempts, Thomas's field was 1.5 acres. The plot by the stream was 20 square meters. The difference in scale was enormous. By the end of the 3rd day, Dan had plowed only 1/3 of it. He left the remaining 2/3 to Thomas. He explained how to apply manure, how to water, how to tell what the plant needed by the color of its leaves. Thomas listened in silence. Then he muttered that he'd give it a try. He left. He didn't say thank you. Dan wasn't expecting thanks. He was expecting results. The results came 10 days later. The barley on the plowed-over third had grown a hand's width taller than on the other 2/3. The ears were thicker. The leaves were greener. Thomas came in the evening. He stood in the doorway of Dan's house. Silently, he placed a bundle of dried meat on the threshold. Then he left. After Thomas, Elsie, the widow, came. She had a tiny vegetable garden against the back wall of her house, 3 beds where stunted cabbage grew. Elsie was raising 4 children. The youngest was 2 years old. Dan looked at her garden. The problem was simple: shade. The house was positioned so that the wall blocked the sun from the garden beds from noon until evening. The cabbage only got sunlight in the morning. Dan asked if the garden beds could be moved. Elsie said there was nowhere else to put them. The yard was small. Out front was a well-trodden patch where the children played. Dan thought for a moment. Then he suggested something else, replacing the cabbage with plants that grow in the shade: spinach, sorrel, and Swiss chard, if they could find the seeds. Elsie didn't know what spinach was. Dan explained. Leafy greens, rich in vitamins. They grow quickly. They like shade and moisture. Elsie asked if they tasted good. Dan said that if you sautéed them with goat fat and onions, the kids would fight over seconds. Elsie smiled, for the first time during their conversation. Dan found some sorrel seeds in his shed, a forgotten little bag in the corner. The seeds were old but still viable. He planted 3 rows in Elsie's garden beds and watered them with a watering can. A week later, the sorrel stood as tall as a wall, bright green, with wide, succulent leaves. Elsie came to Dan with a pot of sorrel soup. She set it on the table. She said the children hadn't fought over seconds. They'd asked for more. Politely, for the first time. Word spread through the village. Not quickly. Quiet Creek was small, and the people there were used to not believing rumors. But the fields didn't lie. The green strip by the stream was visible from anywhere in the village. Elsie's garden bed stood out as a lush patch against the backdrop of gray walls. Thomas's barley on the plowed plot was twice as tall as the rest. People watched, and slowly, one by one, they began to come. In the first month, Dan visited 6 households. Each time it was the same routine. He'd walk the land for hours. He'd feel the soil. He'd smell it. He'd think. Then he'd explain what was wrong. And he'd offer a simple solution. No magic, no spells. Crop rotation, compost, proper watering. Matching the crop to the soil, not the soil to the crop. He used a plow only on the heaviest plots. People could do the rest themselves with ordinary tools. Dan understood this, and that was important. He couldn't keep walking through other people's fields with his tools forever. He needed to teach people to do it without him. Lena went everywhere with him. She wrote everything down. What kind of soil, what the problem was, what the solution was, and what the result was after a week, after 2 weeks. After a month. Her notebook, once just scraps of paper, had grown into a thick stack bound with coarse thread. Dan called it a field journal. Lena called it a book of miracles. Dan would correct her every time. Not miracles, agronomy. But not everyone in the village was happy about it. Bran the blacksmith was a burly man with a red face and heavy hands. He forged tools for the entire region and considered himself the second most important person in the village after the village headman. When Oren grew old and stepped down, Bran expected to take his place. He didn't like the appearance of a boy who had suddenly become the center of the village. Bran began to speak. Not openly, in whispers. At the smithy over a mug of beer, in line at the well. He said that the Nameless One couldn't do what he was doing, that the goddess hadn't denied him a class for no reason, that his tools were surely dark artifacts, that he would bring trouble upon them. Dan knew what Bran was saying. Lena had told him. Dan didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He knew that words don't work against fear, only results do. So he kept doing what he was doing, digging, planting, growing, feeding. But one evening, Bran moved from words to action. Dan found his plot by the stream dug up. Someone had walked through the garden beds at night, trampled the young carrot sprouts, and turned the furrows upside down. Dan stood at the edge and watched. Lena stood beside him. She was trembling with anger. Dan said nothing. Then he crouched down. He examined the damage. He stood up. He said we'd replant the carrots, that the roots weren't damaged, that the soil was just trampled, not killed. He said he'd fix everything by morning. Lena asked who had done it. Dan shrugged. He said it didn't matter. He worked until dawn. He straightened out the furrows. He replanted the pulled-up sprouts. He watered them with a watering can. By morning, the field looked just as it had before. Bran stood by his smithy and watched. Dan walked past. He nodded to him as usual. Bran said nothing. But Dan noticed that his hands were clenched into fists. This wasn't the last problem he'd have with the blacksmith. Dan knew that. But right now, he had more important things to do. By the end of the first month, what he'd been working toward began to emerge from the ground. His first real garden bed. Carrots, potatoes, onions. Bright, lush, and even. Dan stood at the edge of the field in the sunset light and looked at the greenery. Behind him stood Lena with a notebook. Nearby loomed Thomas, who had come to watch and stayed. A little further away was Elsie, the widow, holding her youngest child. They were all looking at the same thing, at the greenery, at the living greenery on the dead earth. Dan turned to face them. He said that in 2 weeks there would be the first harvest of carrots, that there would be enough for everyone. No one answered. They just stood there and watched. In a world where the earth is dying, a green sprout isn't just agronomy, it's hope. Word spread beyond the village by the 6th week. The merchant was the first to arrive. A short, stout man in a dusty coat, pulling a wagon harnessed to a skinny horse. His name was Pete. He traveled from village to village, buying up the remnants of the harvest for copper coins and selling them in the city for silver. The usual routine. Dan had seen guys like that in every state. Only instead of a wagon, it was a pickup truck. And instead of copper coins, it was a rock-bottom price per bushel. Pitt stopped at the entrance to the village, and at first couldn't believe his eyes. Greenery. A green patch in the middle of a gray, lifeless countryside. The rows were as straight as a ruler. The carrot tops were bright and tall. The potato plants were dark and sturdy. A wall of onions. Pitt climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the field. He found Dan on his knees with a hoe. The guy was weeding between the rows. Pete stood there watching for a minute. Then he asked, "How much?" Dan looked up. "How much of what?" Pete said, "Everything. The whole crop. I'll name my price." Dan stood up. He wiped his hands on his pants. He looked at Pete. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the horse, whose ribs were sticking out through its skin. He asked how much Pete usually paid. Pete named his price. Dan did the math in his head. It was about 1/5 of what the harvest was worth. Maybe 1/6. Dan said no. Pete was surprised. Around here, people didn't haggle. They took what they were given and were happy with it. Dan explained. He doesn't sell to middlemen. If someone from a neighboring village needs food, he's willing to trade for what he needs. Seeds, tools, cloth, wood. A direct exchange with no middlemen. Pete laughed. He said the kid didn't understand how the world worked, that villages can't survive without merchants, that the roads are dangerous, that he, Pete, is the only link between these burrows and civilization. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he said that Pete's horse was hungry. He offered to feed it some carrot tops while they talked. Pete fell silent. He looked at his horse. He looked at the carrots. He nodded. While the horse munched on the tops, Dan cooked Pete a bowl of vegetable soup, thick and hot, with potatoes, onions, and sorrel. Pete ate in silence, and he finished. He looked at the empty bowl. He looked at Dan. He asked what kind of sorrel it was. He'd never eaten anything like it before. Dan said it was just regular sorrel, just grown the right way. Pete drove off with an empty wagon, but he came back a week later. He brought a sack of wheat seeds and 2 rolls of coarse cloth. He asked if he could trade them for 3 sacks of potatoes. Dan agreed. Pete left. He came back 2 weeks later. He brought nails, rope, and a sack of salt. Another merchant came looking for him, then another. The rumor spread slowly but surely. In the 8th week, it wasn't merchants who came. It was people. 3 from the village of Log, a 2-day journey away. 2 men and a woman, skinny as skeletons. They said they'd heard about the field that was growing. They asked if it was true. Dan showed them. They stood at the edge and said nothing. Then the older man said that their village had had 3 years of crop failures, that 6 people had died that winter, that if nothing changed, no one would survive the coming winter. He asked if Dan could come to their village, to look at their land, to help. Dan stood there and thought. It was a 2-day journey. That meant leaving Quiet Creek for at least a week, leaving his fields unattended, without a watering can, without a plow. He looked at Lena. Lena was standing nearby with her notebook. She already knew what he was going to say. She knew it before he did. Dan said no. The people from Log froze, but Dan continued. He said he couldn't come to them, but he could teach them. If they stayed for 3 days, he'd show them the basics, what to do with their land, how to determine soil composition, how to set up crop rotation, and how to compost. They wouldn't be able to replicate what he did with the tools, but they'd be able to do enough to survive. The man looked at his companions. Then he nodded. For 3 days, Dan taught them. It was harder than working the fields, much harder, because these people knew nothing. To them, the earth was just dirt into which you threw seed and prayed. Crop rotation was a foreign concept. Compost was trash. The idea that different plants take different nutrients from the soil and return different nutrients seemed like witchcraft to them. Dan was patient. He'd take a handful of soil and demonstrate. This is clay. This is sand. These are root remnants. See how they differ? Clay holds water. Sand lets it through. You need both, in the right proportions. He drew on the ground with a stick. Here's a field. We divide it into 3 parts. The first year, grain here, beans here. This part stays fallow. The second year we rotate the crops. The third year we rotate them again. People listened. They nodded. They didn't understand everything, but they took notes. Lena helped. She already knew the material better than any of them and explained in simple terms what Dan had phrased too technically. He noticed this and thought that Lena was a natural teacher, better than he was. On the third day, the people from Sarilog left. Each carried a small bag of pea and turnip seeds and a stack of notes written by Lena's hand. Dan stood at the edge of the village and watched them leave. Lena stood beside him. She said there were 3 of them, but hundreds of villages all around. Dan nodded. He said he knew. He said that's why he needed a school, not legs. Lena looked at him. He looked at her. There was a question in her eyes. He answered before she could ask. He said it was too early. First, they had to get through the winter, then spring, then harvest their first real crop, and only then could they think about school. It was on that very evening that she appeared. Dan was sitting on the porch eating boiled potatoes with salt when a figure appeared on the road. Tall, in a dark hooded cloak, a sword at his belt. The figure walked unsteadily, swaying from side to side. Dan stood up. Lena came up behind him. The figure reached the yard and stopped. She pulled back her hood. A girl, young, with short black hair and an Eastern European face, high cheekbones, a sharp chin. Her eyes were dark as wet earth. On her left cheek was a fresh scar, running from her temple to her jaw. Her cloak was torn in 3 places. On her right side, a dark stain showed through the fabric. She looked at Dan. She looked at the field behind him. Then her knees buckled and she fell. Dan caught her. She was heavy, muscular beneath her cloak, and hot. Heat radiated from her in waves. The wound on her side was inflamed and festering. Dan dragged her inside. Lena ran to get water. He laid the girl down on his straw. He took off her cloak. Underneath was leather armor caked with dried blood, his own and someone else's. The sword at her belt was nicked and darkened from frequent use. An adventurer, or a warrior, or both. The wound was nasty, a deep cut, not from a sword, from claws. Something with curved claws had slashed across her ribs and torn the flesh open to the palm of her hand. Dan wasn't a doctor, but he knew wounds. Farmers cut and maim themselves all the time. He'd seen his father stitch up his own hand with coarse thread after getting caught in a mower. He rinsed the wound with water from a watering can. The water grew warm and slightly viscous. It smelled of something bitter, antiseptic. The watering can provided just what was needed. Dan wrapped the wound in a clean cloth. Kim Seon-hwa didn't tell him everything right away. For the first 2 days, she lay on the straw and said nothing. She ate what Dan brought her. She drank water from the watering can. The wound was healing faster than it should have. Dan changed the bandages and noted this silently. The water from the watering can was working. Not like a magical healing, more like a properly formulated cleansing solution, an antiseptic, an anti-inflammatory, a regeneration stimulant. All in one. The watering can gave the wound what it needed, just as it gave the turnip what the turnip needed. Dan wasn't surprised. He had long since stopped being surprised by the artifacts. He simply used them as he would any tool, with understanding and respect. On the 3rd day, Sonva got up. She went out into the yard. She saw the field. She stood there for a long time looking at it. Then she turned to Dan, who was carrying a bucket of manure for the compost pile. She asked what kind of place this was. Dan said it was Quiet Creek, a village, the very edge of the kingdom of Arkarin. Sonva shook her head. She said that wasn't what she meant. She asked why it was green here. Everywhere else was gray. But here it was green. Dan set down the bucket. He said the earth wasn't naturally gray. It was gray because it had been mistreated. If treated properly, it turns green. Sonva looked at him with that look Dan had already learned to recognize. The look of someone who doesn't understand but wants to. She asked who he was. Dan said he was a farmer. A nameless one. Sonva snorted. She said that nameless people don't grow in 2 weeks what others can't grow in a year. Dan shrugged. He picked up the bucket. He walked over to the compost pit. On the fourth day, Sonwa told him, she was a third-rank adventurer swordswoman, a squad of 6 people. Their mission was to clear out the rift near the border of the eastern route. The rift turned out to be deeper than the report had indicated. Instead of spiked boars, rotten reapers crawled out of it. There were 3 times as many creatures as expected. The squad's mage was the first to die, then the healer, then the tank, then the scout. Sankva and the archer fought back-to-back for 3 hours. The archer was struck in the chest and fell. Sankva fought her way to the exit of the rift, alone, with a wound in her side and her friend's blood on her sword. She walked west for 4 days. Why west? Because home was to the east, and she couldn't go back home. Not empty-handed, not alone. Her squad had perished because she, as their commander, hadn't verified the intelligence. She hadn't insisted on additional reconnaissance. She'd trusted a piece of paper bearing the guild's seal. 5 people were dead because she'd been lazy. She said this in an even voice, staring at the wall. No tears, no trembling, as if she were reading a report. Dan listened. He knew that voice. The voice of someone who had already cried their eyes out and burned out and was now simply stating the facts. He'd heard that voice from farmers after a tornado. When you're standing in the middle of what used to be your home, describing to an insurance agent what you've lost. Calmly and precisely. Because if you start crying, you won't be able to stop. Dan didn't say it wasn't her fault. He didn't say she wasn't to blame. Because she was to blame. Partly. And she knew it. And lying about her innocence would only have insulted her. Instead, he said that tomorrow morning he had a problem with the north garden bed. Wild boars from the forest come out at night and dig up the potatoes. Twice this week. He said that if someone with a sword could sit by the garden at night, it would be helpful. Sonva looked at him. For a long time. Then she nodded. She sat by the garden all night. At dawn, Dan found 3 carcasses of spiked boars by the fence. Each one the size of a large dog. Killed cleanly, with a single blow. Songfa was sitting on a stump, cleaning her sword, and looked calmer than she had in all the previous days. Dan looked at the boars. He asked if they were edible. Songfa said the meat was toxic because of the rift's mana, but the bones and hides could be used. Dan nodded. Bones. Bone meal. Phosphorus and cal. Exactly what the outlying areas were lacking. He butchered the boars. He buried the meat deep beyond the fields. He stacked the bones in a separate pit for processing. He gave the hides to Thomas, who knew how to tan them. In the evening, he cooked dinner for Sonva. Stewed potatoes with onions and herbs from the small little garden he'd planted against the back wall of the house. Thyme, rosemary, bay leaves. He'd found the seeds at the herbalist's in the neighboring yard. She didn't know what to do with them. Sonwa ate in silence. Then she set down her empty bowl. She looked at Dan. She said it had been a long time since she'd eaten a hot meal that someone had prepared especially for her. In the unit, they ate dry rations. Before joining the unit, she'd eaten in the guild's barracks. Before the barracks, she'd eaten at the table in her father's trading house, where food was a political tool. Every dish was served with a purpose: to impress a guest, to display status, to seal a deal. No one had ever set a bowl in front of her simply because she was hungry. Dan listened. Then he stood up and served her seconds. Sonwa looked at the second bowl. Then she began to eat, devouring it quickly and greedily like a starving beast. Dan stepped out onto the porch so as not to embarrass her. He sat down. He looked at the stars. The stars here were different, unfamiliar constellations, a foreign sky. But the ground beneath her feet smelled like earth. And that was enough. Sonhwa stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go. She did have a place to go. She could return to the guild, get a new squad, go back to the rifts. But she stayed. Dan didn't ask why. He gave her a job, a simple, concrete one with a clear outcome: to guard the fields from the creatures of the forest. Every night. Songfa took it on with the seriousness of a warrior taking an oath. She patrolled the perimeter from sunset to sunrise. In the first week, she killed 11 spiny boars, 2 rotten rats, and 1 creature that even she couldn't identify, something like a snake with legs. The bones of all the creatures were recycled. Dan built a simple bone crusher out of 2 flat stones and Brand's hammer, which the blacksmith had reluctantly lent him. Bone meal mixed with ash and goat manure produced a fertilizer that even the dead gray earth began to respond to. But the most important thing was something else. With Sankva on guard, the village, for the first time in years, stopped losing its harvest to nighttime raids. Before, the creatures from the rift would come every 3 or 4 days. They'd ravage the garden beds. They'd kill the livestock. Sometimes they maimed people. Now they came and never returned. The residents of Quiet Creek didn't realize this right away. But after 2 weeks, Thomas announced at a town meeting that, for the first time in 10 years, all his chickens were still alive. Elsie added that her youngest had stopped crying at night because of the sounds coming from the forest. Bran said nothing. By the 10th week, the rift had made its presence in a serious way. Dan was standing in the field, checking the root system of the young potatoes when the ground shook. Not much. As if someone far away had dropped something heavy. Dan looked up. To the east, beyond the forest, the sky had darkened. Not clouds. Something else. As if the air had grown denser and stopped letting light through. Sangva stood beside him. Her sword was in her hand in an instant. She said one word. The rift. A new rift was opening in the forest. That meant that in a few hours, creatures would start crawling out of it. Lots of creatures. More than usual. A new rift always sent out a wave. The village stirred. People were dragging their children into their homes. They were boarding up the shutters. Thomas came with an axe. Elsie was gathering her things. Bran stood by the forge and looked up at the sky. Dan stood in the field and thought, not about the battle, about the potatoes. The first harvest was in 2 weeks. If the creatures trampled the field, everything would be lost. 2 months of work, all their food for the winter. He turned to Sanhua. He asked how much time they had. She said 4 to 6 hours until the first wave. Dan nodded. He ran to the shed. He grabbed a hoe and a watering can. He returned to the field. He started working. Sanhua looked at him as if he were crazy. He said he wasn't going to run away. He said he needed to prepare the field. Sanhua asked what for. Dan explained as he went, driving the hoe into the furrows. If you water the field in a certain way and loosen the topsoil to the right depth, the watering can release water that, as it evaporates, will create a mist, a thick, dense mist that spreads across the ground. The creature from the rift navigates by scent and vibration. The mist alone won't stop it. But if you saturate it with the right minerals through the watering can, the scents will mix and the creature will lose its bearings. It'll stray from its path. It'll pass right by the village. Sonva listened. Then she asked how he knew that. Dan replied that he'd guessed. Sonva looked at him for a long time. Then she said it was the craziest tactic she'd ever heard. And she went to sharpen her sword in case the fog didn't work. Dan worked for 4 hours. He plowed a strip of land along the entire eastern edge of the trees, 10 paces wide. He poured water from a watering can over it. The watering can sang in his hands. He felt it as an extension of his own arm. He knew what it provided. Water with a high sulfur and potassium content. As it evaporated from the warm, loose soil, it would produce a thick white mist with a pungent odor that would overpower any other. Biochemistry, not magic. Although the line between them in this world was thinner than he would have liked. By sunset, the strip began to rise. The white mist rose from the ground slowly and heavily. It spread across the field. It filled the space between the village and the forest, thick as milk. Sankva stood at the edge of the mist with her sword. Behind her stood Thomas with an axe and 3 other men with pitchforks and sticks. Lena was inside the house with the children and the elderly. Bran stood by his forge with a hammer. He hadn't joined the others, but he hadn't left either. They were waiting. The first wave came an hour after sunset. Dan heard them before he saw them. A screech, the crackling of branches, the pounding of countless paws on the forest floor. The sound came like a wall. Dozens of creatures, maybe more. They emerged from the forest and crashed into the fog, and fell silent. Not all at once. The front ranks flew into the white wall and began to thrash about. The screech changed, confused. They circled in place. They bumped into one another. Dan stood behind the fog line and listened. It was working. The sulfur was disrupting their sense of smell. The mineral suspension was dampening the vibrations. The creatures couldn't sense the village. They could only sense the fog and each other. Half an hour later, most of the wave had headed south, past the village, into the empty fields. 3 boars did manage to break through the fog. Songfa killed them before they reached the first garden bed. Clean, quick, without a single wasted movement. By dawn, the fog had cleared. The field was intact. The village stood. Not a single person wounded. Not a single person killed. By the end of the third month, Dan stood on a hill behind the village and looked down. What he saw was no longer the quiet creek of old. The fields were green in 4 places. The plot by the creek had expanded into a full-fledged vegetable garden. The northern bed, which he had laid out with Thomas's help, yielded potatoes and onions. The western wedge, sown with peas and turnips, stretched from the outskirts to an old stump. And Elsie's garden, behind the back wall of her house, stood as a wall of sorrel and spinach. Between the houses, paths had appeared, trodden down, alive. People were visiting one another. They hadn't done that before. Before, they'd sit in their homes and wait. What were they waiting for? Maybe winter. Maybe death. Maybe a miracle. The miracle came in the form of a 16-year-old boy with a hoe. But Dan wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking that the peas in the western plot had started to turn yellow, which meant the pH had shifted toward the acidic side and he needed to apply ash. He walked down the hill and headed toward the peas. The priestess arrived on the 5th day of the 4th month, riding a mule, dressed in the white robes of the Temple of the Harvest, young, with a stern face and cold eyes. Her name was Sister Cora. She had been sent from the nearest temple in the city of Varnhold to investigate the reports. The reports said that in the village of Quiet Stream, a nameless boy was growing crops that didn't exist, that the fields were turning green without magic, that the sick were recovering from turnips. The temple took such things seriously, too seriously, because if miracles occur without the goddess's blessing, it means they are happening against her will. And that is heresy. Sister Cora rode into the village in silence. She dismounted at the village headman's house. Oren came out and bowed low, too low. Dan saw it from the field. He saw the old man bend double. He saw the priestess looking down at him from above. He saw her walk through the village, touching the walls of the houses as if checking them for impurity. She reached the field by the stream. She stopped. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned and looked at Dan, who was standing knee-deep in peas with a hoe in his hands. She approached. She asked his name. He told her. She asked him about his class. He said he had no class. Nameless. The priestess narrowed her eyes. She asked what he used to work the soil. Dan pointed to the hoe. The priestess looked at the tool. She held out her hand. Dan handed it to her. She took the hoe and immediately dropped it, not because of its weight, but because of the heat. The handle burned her palm. She jerked her hand back. She looked at the red mark on her skin. She looked at Dan. There was something in her eyes that Dan didn't want to see. Fear. She said it was an artifact of unknown origin. She said that according to temple law, all magical items must be registered and appraised. She said Dan had to hand over the tools to the temple for inspection. Dan bent, picked up the hoe from the ground. It lay warm and pliable in his hand. He said he wouldn't hand it over. The priestess stood up straight. She said it wasn't a request. Dan looked her in the eyes. He said he understood. But he still wouldn't give them up. Without these tools, the village wouldn't survive the winter. 23 people, including 7 children. They would all die. If the temple wanted to take the tools, let them send someone who would feed these people in his place. The priestess was silent. Then she said she would return. She turned around. She walked over to the mule. She rode away. Lena approached Dan after the priestess left. She was pale. Her hands were clenching the notebook so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She said the temple would not back down, that the priests never back down, that if they decide Dan is a heretic, they'll send the inquisitors. Dan listened. He nodded. He didn't know what the inquisitors were in this world, but the word sounded ominous in any world. He said he understood. He said he'd think about it. For now, he had more important things to do. The peas were turning yellow. Lena looked at him. In her eyes was a mixture of irritation and admiration. She had long noticed that Dan responded to every threat in the same way, with work. They threaten him with a sword. He plants a bow. They threaten him with the temple. He brings in ashes, as if the earth were more important than anything else. And maybe, she thought, that's exactly how it is. Sonhua took a different view of the priestess's visit. She stood by the gate and watched the mule until it disappeared around the bend. Then she went to Dan. She said they needed to prepare. She said the temple wasn't like bandits from the forest. The temple has knights, mages, an army. If they decide Dan is dangerous, they'll come without asking. Dan said he understood. Sonhwa asked if he had a plan. Dan said he did. Sonhwa asked what it was. Dan said he was going to grow the biggest crop this region had seen in the last 100 years. Sonhwa was silent. Then she said that wasn't a plan. Dan smiled. He said it was the only plan he had. Sonhwa shook her head, but she stayed by the gate, on guard, just like every night. In the middle of the 4th month, the first big harvest came in. Dan knew that this moment would change everything, either for the better or for the worse. He woke up the village at dawn. He asked everyone to come to the field by the stream. Everyone came, even Bran. They stood at the edge and looked at the rows of carrots, potatoes, onions, and turnips, green against the gray earth, like an oasis in the middle of the desert. Dan walked out into the field. He crouched down. He pulled up the first carrot, bright orange, thick as a finger. He'd never seen a carrot like that, not even in Iowa. The machines had done their job. The land he knew was yielding its very best. He held up the carrot so everyone could see it. Then he began harvesting. People stood watching. Then one by one, hands reached out to help. Thomas stood beside him and began digging up potatoes. Elsie was harvesting onions. Old Martha, who had given them the first turnip seeds, was now pulling up turnips with a smile. The children ran between the rows, carrying root vegetables to the wagon. Lena kept count. She recorded every sack. By noon, the wagon was full. 200 kilograms, maybe more, from a plot of land that had been barren just 3 months ago. Dan stood next to the wagon, dirty, wet, and happy. Not because the harvest was bountiful, but because people were smiling. He hadn't seen smiles in Quiet Creek since the very first day. Now he did. That evening, he organized a communal dinner, the first in the village's history. He set up a long table made of planks on trestles right in the yard. He cooked a huge pot of soup, potato soup with carrots, onions, and herbs, so thick that a spoon could stand upright in it. He sliced the turnips into chunks and roasted them over coals. He made a salad of sorrel and spinach with goat cheese, which he'd traded for a sack of potatoes with a shepherd from a neighboring farmstead. People sat down at the table and ate. Silently at first. Then someone spoke up. Then someone else. Then the children laughed. Then Marta began to sing. An old song they used to sing back when there was still a harvest in these parts. 20 years ago. Dan sat at the end of the table eating his soup. Lena was next to him. Across the table was Songfa, who was eating enough for 3, as usual. Bran sat at the other end. He ate in silence. But he was eating. It was something else. After dinner, Dan announced a plan. Not a plan, a proposal. He said he wanted to sell part of the harvest, not to middlemen, directly, to 3 neighboring villages that needed food: Greylog, Bear's Corner, Crooked Birch. He proposed taking a quarter of the harvest there and exchanging it for what Quiet Creek needed: seeds for the next season, lumber, cloth, and iron for tools. People listened. Thomas asked who would make the trip. Dan said he would go himself, with Sonva for protection. Bran raised his head. For the first time that evening, he spoke up. He said the boy was making too many decisions for everyone. He said the harvest belonged to everyone, not just Dan. He said it wasn't up to him to decide where to take it. It grew quiet. Dan looked at Bran. He said the harvest had grown on no man's land, on a plot no one wanted, from seeds no one had planted, with hands no one had asked for. But if the village wanted to vote, he agreed. Let them vote. Oren stood up, slowly. He looked at Bran. He looked at Dan. He said there was no need to vote. He said that Dan had saved his daughter, saved the village from the rift, grown food on dead land. If he says a quarter needs to be sold, then a quarter needs to be sold. Bran clenched his jaw. He stood up. He walked away, but he didn't slam the door. Dan noticed that. Progress. The next morning, Dan and Sonhwa loaded the wagon. 4 sacks of potatoes, 2 sacks of carrots, a sack of onions, a sack of turnips. Lena wanted to go with them. Dan said no. Someone had to stay behind and water the crops. She was the only one who knew the schedule. Lena pressed her lips together, but she nodded. Sonhwa harnessed the mule that Oren had lent them. They set out at dawn. The road to Grey Hollow ran through the wasteland and the edge of the forest. Songfa sat on the box with a sword on her lap, looking around. Dan sat next to her, staring at the ground. the gray, lifeless earth stretching to the horizon. After 2 hours of travel, he asked to stop. He climbed down from the wagon and walked to the roadside. He scooped up a handful of soil. He rubbed it between his fingers. He sniffed it. Songfa asked what he was doing. Dan said he was checking. It was the same problem everywhere. The topsoil was depleted. Zero organic matter. The acidity was off the charts. This soil had been destroyed for hundreds of years. Not on purpose, out of ignorance. People simply didn't know what they were doing. Songfa asked if it could be fixed. Dan tossed the soil aside. He wiped his hands. He said it could be fixed. Everything can be fixed. But not quickly, not alone, and not with a hoe. It takes people, dozens, hundreds, people who know what to do, people who've been taught by someone. Songfa looked at him. Then she said he sounded like a general before a campaign. Dan chuckled. He said he wasn't a general. He's a farmer. Just a farmer with a very large field. Gray Log greeted them with silence. The village was even smaller than Quiet Creek. 8 houses, half with collapsed roofs. The people came out slowly, thin, gray-faced with empty eyes. The man who had come for help 2 months ago stood at the front. He saw the wagon and froze. Then he saw the sacks. Then he realized what was in the sacks. His expression changed. Dan climbed down from the wagon. He said he'd brought food, and seeds, and Lena's notes, which could teach them how to do the same. The man looked at the sacks, then at Dan. Then his legs gave way and he sat down right on the ground. The woman behind him covered her face with her hands. A child of about 5 walked up to the wagon and touched the sack of carrots. Then he looked up at Dan. Dan took a carrot out of the sack. He held it out. The child took it, took a bite, chewed with his eyes closed. Dan watched him and thought about cover crops, about how here, on this gray soil, he could plant winter rye right now, and by spring it would yield green matter that would go into the compost, and in a year the field would begin to come back to life. He thought about crop rotation and legumes, and about how peas would grow here if the soil's acidity were corrected. He thought about 10 villages, and 100, and 1,000, about how many people could be fed if each of them learned to do what he was doing, without machinery, with ordinary hands, with an ordinary hoe, with ordinary knowledge that, back on Earth, was in every textbook but didn't exist here. He helped unload the wagon. He showed the people from Sarilog the seeds. He explained what to do with them. He repeated what he'd told their envoys 2 months ago. Crop rotation, compost, drainage, crop selection. They listened. This time they listened more attentively, because in their hands, they held carrots that had grown on dead soil. The proof lay on their tongues, sweet and crunchy. The merchant's wife appeared on the 3rd day of the 5th month. Her wagon was sturdy. Her horse was well fed. A men's-style doublet fit her like a glove. Her red hair was tucked under a traveling hat. Her face was sharp, with a slender nose and eyes that took in everything they fell upon. Sacks on the wagon, planks on the fence, people in the yard. She rode into Tiki Ruche at sunset, and the first thing she did was look out at the fields, for a long time. Then she dismounted at the village headman's house. She introduced herself. Margaret Ashford, Ashford Trading Company, formerly a trading company. It went bankrupt 2 years ago. Her father drank. Her partners scattered. The debts fell on her, the sole heir. She'd been paying them off for 3 years and still wasn't done. She traveled from village to village, buying whatever she could and selling wherever she could. She lived out of a wagon. She slept on sacks. She could do calculations on an abacus faster than most mages could on parchment. She heard about Quiet Creek from Pete. He'd mentioned at the Warnhold Tavern that there was a village where a boy grew vegetables that didn't grow anywhere else. Pete told the story with such a look on his face that Maggie decided to check it out. Dan met her on the porch. He'd just finished spreading ash on the western field, and his hands were gray up to his elbows. Maggie looked at him. She looked at his hands. She looked at the field behind him. She said she wanted to talk about trade. Dan said he was listening. Maggie sat down on the step next to him. She pulled a rolled-up parchment from behind her belt. She unrolled it. It was a map, rough but detailed. Villages, roads, towns, fairs, trade routes. Maggie pointed to a spot at the edge of the map, Quiet Creek. Then she drew a line to the nearest town, Warnhold, 2 days' journey. Then to the fair in Crossstone, 4 days. Then to the capital, 10. She said that Dan was sitting on a gold mine, that the vegetables he grew were worth 20 times more in the capital than he realized, that a single carrot of his quality at the Arc Arena restaurant would cost a silver coin. Dan listened. Then he said he wasn't going to sell to the capital. Maggie raised an eyebrow. She asked why. Dan said he didn't need silver. He needed the people around him to eat. Maggie looked at him for 5 seconds. Then she laughed. Not maliciously. Surprised. She said it was the first time she'd met someone who turned down money, not because he was foolish, but because he wanted something else. Dan said he needed money, but not silver from the capital. He needed seeds, tools, fruit tree saplings if he could find them, building materials, medicine, everything that couldn't be grown in a garden. Maggie listened, and Dan saw something he recognized light up in her eyes. A calculation, a plan, a path from point A to point B via 5 intermediate steps. She was already crunching the numbers. Maggie said she could arrange it, that she had connections in 4 cities, that she knew who sold seeds, who transported seedlings, and who bought vegetables at a fair price. She said she needed only one thing, a share, not in money, but in space. She wanted to live here, run her business from here, and make Quiet Creek a hub for a barter network between the villages. Dan looked at her, then at the map, then at the field behind him. He said he needed to think it over. Maggie nodded. She said she'd spend the night in the wagon if she could. Dan said there was no need. He said there was an empty house in the village. The roof was leaky, but the walls were sound. If she wanted, she could stay there. Maggie stayed. For the first week, she walked around the village and took stock. People, fields, supplies, distances, trails, water sources. She compiled a list of everything Quiet Creek had and everything it lacked. The list was long. Almost everything was missing. Iron for tools, cloth for clothing, salt, soap, medicine, rope, nails, glass, paper, candles. Dan looked at the list. He looked at Maggie. He asked what she suggested. Maggie spread out a map on the table in Dan's house. She pointed to 3 spots: Gray Log, Bear's Corner, Crooked Birch. 3 villages Dan had already helped or was helping. Each had something Quiet Creek lacked. Gray Log had goats and wool. Bear's Corner had the forest and hunters. Crooked Birch had clay and a potter. If they organized an exchange among the 4 villages, each would get what it lacked and give away what they have in excess. No silver, no middlemen, direct barter on fair terms. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he said the idea was good, but there was a problem: the roads. There's no safe path between the villages. Creatures from the rifts roam the wastelands. Unescorted caravans won't make it through. Maggie looked at Sonhua, who was standing in the doorway. Sonhua looked at Dan. Dan looked at Sonhua. Sonhua sighed. She said she needed 2 more swords, at least. Maggie said she knew where to find fighters. 2 guys from Warnhold, former guards, fired for drunkenness. But when they're sober, they fight well. Sonhua said she'd never come across any sober guards. Maggie said she'd be responsible for keeping them sober. Dan would be feeding them. And his food doesn't make you want to drink. It makes you want to live. The barter network was up and running by the 6th month. Slowly. With a lot of friction. With endless arguments about how much a sack of potatoes was worth in terms of goat's wool. Maggie settled these disputes with the precision of a pharmacy scale. She knew the value of everything. Literally everything. Dan once asked how much a sunset was worth. Without batting an eye, Maggie replied that it depended on cloud cover, because clouds affect the dew, and dew affects the morning watering, and watering affects the harvest, which is worth specific figures. Dan laughed. Maggie didn't laugh. She wasn't joking. The first caravan traveled from Quiet Creek to Gray Log in 2 days. Sonkva and 2 guards led it along the edge of the forest. They returned with wool and goat's milk. 0 losses. The second caravan set out for Bear's Corner. It returned with logs and venison. The third went to Krivaya Bereza. It returned with pots and bowls and a large water jug, which Dan immediately repurposed for storing seeds. By the end of the 6th month, Quiet Creek was no longer starving. It wasn't just that it had stopped starving. It had begun to build up reserves. Dan's cellar held sacks of potatoes and carrots and onions, barrels of salted turnips, bundles of dried herbs, jars of goat butter. Maggie kept track of everything. Lena kept track of the fields. Together, they monitored everything that came into and left the village, down to the very last turnip. One evening, Dan found Maggie on the porch of her house. The roof had been repaired. The walls had been patched up. Inside stood a table piled high with parchments and ledgers. Maggie sat there, staring into the darkness. No ledgers, no parchments. She was just sitting there. Dan sat down next to her. He set a bowl in front of her. Hot apple compote, made from wild apples he'd found at the edge of the forest, and simmered with honey he'd traded to a beekeeper for 2 sacks of potatoes. He said one thing. Just sit there. Don't count anything. Maggie looked at the bowl, then at Dan. Then she took the bowl in both hands. She brought it to her face. The steam smelled of apples and honey and cinnamon, which Dan had found in one of the bundles in the shed. She drank in small sips. Then she stopped drinking and just held the bowl. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Quietly, soundlessly. She cried for a long time. Dan sat beside her and said nothing. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to comfort her. He was just there. An hour later, Maggie set the empty bowl down on the step. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She said she couldn't remember the last time someone had simply given her something warm. No strings attached. No deal. Dan said it was a gift, not a deal. Maggie looked at him. For a long time. Then she said she'd stay here. Not because it was profitable, because it was warm here. And she'd long forgotten what that felt like. Dan nodded. He stood up. He left. He had an early watering tomorrow. At the beginning of the 7th month, a night arrived. The middlemen, Pete and Maggie, were just business. The priestess Cora was a threat. But the knight was authority. Real authority. With the crown seal on his breastplate and a charter in a leather tube. His name was Sir Galen Rock, a broad-shouldered, gray-haired veteran with a weary and calm eyes. He arrived with 2 squires and an order to deliver 40 measures of healing turnips to the capital for the needs of the royal court. Dan stood before him and listened. 40 measures is 400 kilograms, half of the entire turnip supply. If they gave it up, the village wouldn't die. But the trade network he had just begun to build would lose its main commodity. The 3 villages that depended on his turnips would be left without food. Dan didn't refuse right away. Instead, he invited the knight to dinner. Dan spent 2 hours cooking. He knew that this dinner would decide more than any argument ever could. Sir Galen Rock had spent his life in the saddle and in barracks. He ate field rations, salted meat, and stale bread. He didn't remember the taste of real food. Dan understood that, because he'd seen it before. Farmers from Iowa who lived on canned food and fast food in the middle of thousands of acres of fertile land. People forget that food can be more than just fuel. Dan was going to remind him. He started with soup, potato soup, thick, with wild garlic and rosemary and a pinch of salt, as simple as the earth itself. Then a venison stew brought from Bear's Corner. The meat had been braised for 4 hours in a pot with carrots and onions and a drop of goat butter. Tender, melt in your mouth, with an aroma that made your mouth water from 20 paces away. As a side dish, baked turnips with honey. The very same healing turnip the knight had come to collect. Dan served it last, on purpose. Sir Galen ate in silence. He brought the first spoonful of soup to his mouth with the expression of someone going through the motions. After the 3rd spoonful, his expression changed. After the 5th, he set down his spoon and looked into the bowl. Then at Dan. Then back into the bowl. He finished the soup. He took a bite of the roast. He ate slowly. He chewed for a long time. He closed his eyes. Dan saw the tension drain from his shoulders. He saw his fingers, accustomed to gripping a sword hilt, relax. He saw the wrinkles on his forehead smooth out. Galen finished the roast and picked up a turnip. He took a bite. He chewed. He stopped. He set the bowl on the table. He looked at his hands, large, scarred hands that had held a sword for 30 years. He was silent. Then he said quietly that his mother used to cook turnips, a long time ago, when he was a boy, in a village that no longer exists. The rift took it away when he was 12. He hadn't eaten turnips since then. He couldn't. But this one tasted just like it did back then. Dan sat across from him. He listened. He didn't interrupt. Galen raised his head. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. He asked how Dan did it. Dan said that turnips grow in iron-rich soil by a stream. that the water gives them minerals, that if you prepare the soil properly and water them correctly, the turnips take exactly what they need from the earth. It's not magic, it's knowledge. Galen listened. Then he asked what would happen to the village if he took 40 measures. Dan told the truth. He said the village would survive, but the 3 neighboring villages that depend on the barter network would lose 2 months' worth of food. The children in Greylog, who had only just begun to eat properly again, would go hungry. Galen was silent for a long time. Then he asked why Dan was doing all this. He was the nameless one. He had no obligations to these people. He could have left. He could have sold the harvest and lived comfortably. Why? Dan thought about his answer. Then he said that the earth doesn't ask who you are when you plant seeds. It just grows. He's doing the same thing. Galen stayed for 3 days, not because Dan asked him to, because he couldn't leave. He walked through the fields. He watched Dan work. He watched Lena keep records. He watched Sanva patrol the perimeter. He watched Maggie count the wagons. He watched Thomas dig up his plot according to the crop rotation system. He watched Elsie's children run between the garden beds, gathering sorrel. He saw a village that was living. Not just surviving, it was alive. On the morning of the 3rd day, Galen went out to Dan, who was kneeling by a potato bed, checking the tubers. He said he was leaving. He said he wouldn't take the turnips. Dan looked up. Galen took a parchment out of a tube, a letter bearing the royal seal. He turned it over. On the back, he wrote a few lines. He signed it. He affixed his seal. He handed it to Dan. Dan read it. It was a letter to the king. It stated that the village of Quiet Creek produced a harvest of exceptional quality, that confiscating this harvest would lead to famine in 3 dependent settlements, and that, in the opinion of Sir Galen Rock, a knight of the crown, the place needed protection, not plunder. Dan looked at Galen. Galen said he didn't know if the letter would help. He said that few at court listened to knights, but it was worth a try. He mounted his horse. He nodded to his squires. He rode off. On the road, he turned around. He looked at the green speck of the village amid the gray landscape. Then he turned forward and spurred his horse on. After the knight left, Dan expected a respite. He didn't get one. 5 days later, a figure appeared on the road, one that Sonva was the first to notice. A lone traveler. Not a merchant, not a knight. He moved slowly but confidently. Over his shoulders was something resembling a cloak of dark green fabric with silver embroidery. His hair was long and silvery. His ears were pointed. Sonva drew her sword. She said one word. Elf. But not an elf. A half-elf. As the figure drew closer, it became clear. Her face was delicate with sharp features, but not entirely elven. Her eyes were green like a young leaf. Her skin was pale with a slight golden hue. She walked barefoot across the gray earth, and with every step she took, it seemed to Dan that the ground beneath her feet was changing color slightly, growing slightly darker, coming slightly to life. She stopped at edge of the field. She looked at the garden beds. She looked at the plow lying by the fence. Then she looked at Dan, and her face contorted, not from fear, out of anger. She said she could feel the wounds in the earth, that someone was tearing up the soil with iron, that someone was breaking the roots and reshaping life on a whim. She said she'd come to find out who was doing this and to stop them. Dan stood there with a hoe in his hand, looking at her. Then he thrust the hoe into the ground. He wiped his hands on his pants, and he said he'd show her something if she was willing to look before judging. Her name was Illivan Silverin. She was 140 years old. She looked 19. She was the last student of the old Druidic school, which considered any interference with the earth to be an act of violence. The plow was the enemy. The hoe was a weapon. The earth must be free and wild, and decide for itself what grows on it. Dan listened to all of this. Then he led Illivan to his plot by the stream. They walked in silence. She walked barefoot across the plowed earth and winced with every step. Dan stopped at the far edge, where the garden beds ended, and the strip he'd left untouched began. On purpose. 10 square meters of wild land. Weeds grew there, burdocks, clover, wild grass. Bees buzzed among them. Beetles crawled. Midges flitted about. Dan pointed. He said this was a strip for pollinators. that he'd left it that way on purpose, because without bees, his tomatoes wouldn't bear fruit. Without beetles, the mulch wouldn't decompose. Without wild grass, there would be no root system to hold moisture. He said he wasn't at war with the earth. He listens. The earth itself knows what it needs. He simply helps it get what it needs. Illivan stood there. She looked at the wild strip. She looked at the bees. Then she crouched down. She placed her palm on the ground. She closed her eyes. She was silent for a minute. 2. 3. When she opened her eyes, there was something different in them. Not anger, surprise. She said that the earth here doesn't suffer. The earth here sings. Quietly, but it sings. For the first time in a long time. She looked at Dan. She asked how. Dan sat down beside her. He said that he'd removed the toxins from the soil with a hoe, restored its structure with a plow, watered it with a watering can, and then planted what the earth could sustain without pain. He didn't force it. He offered it. Like a doctor offers medicine, not like a soldier hammering home an order. Illivan listened. Then she said that in her 140 years, she'd seen thousands of farmers. They'd all torn up the earth. He was the first one to talk to her. Dan said he wasn't talking. He analyzed samples and made adjustments based on the data. Illivan looked at him. Then, for the first time during their conversation, she smiled. She said it was the same thing, just in different languages. Illivan stayed. Not right away. She left for 3 days. She came back. She left again. She came back again. The 5th time, she came with a small bag. It contained seeds. Wild ones. Forest seeds. Plants Dan didn't recognize. She said she wanted to plant them next to his garden beds, to see how they'd get along. Dan agreed. He set aside a strip of land along the south fence for her. Illivan planted them without any tools, just her hands. She pressed the seeds into the ground with her fingers and whispered something. Dan couldn't hear the words, but he saw the result. 3 days later, sprouts he'd never seen before emerged from the ground. Silvery grass with slender leaves, low bushes with purple flowers, a vine that had wrapped itself around the fence overnight and bloomed white. Dan crouched down beside them. He touched the silvery grass. It was soft and smelled of something far away, something he couldn't quite identify, but that made him breathe deeper. He asked Illivan what it was. She said it was silver grass, an ancient grass. It purifies the air around it and repels parasitic insects. It grows only near living soil. If the soil is dead, silver grass won't sprout. The fact that it had sprouted here meant one thing. Dan hadn't just grown a crop. He had revived the soil. For real. Illivan stood next to him, looking at the silvery grass, the green garden beds, and the bees hovering over the wild strip. She was silent. Then a tear rolled down her cheek. A quiet one. Just one. Dan didn't ask why. He just stood beside her, just as he had stood beside the soil when it began to come to life. Silently. Patiently. With respect for what was happening. Winter arrived in the 9th month. Dan had been preparing for it from day 1. He knew that winter in Orvain killed more people than the rifts. Cold, hunger, disease. The 3 horsemen who come every year and take those who didn't have time to prepare. In Quiet Creek, 11 people had died over the past 5 winters. 4 children. Dan wasn't going to lose a single one. A month before the first snow, he built a greenhouse. It sounds simple. It wasn't. In Orvain, they didn't know what a greenhouse was. There was no glass. There was no plastic sheeting. Dan used what he had. A wooden frame made of logs brought from Bear's Corner. The walls were made of oiled canvas that let light through but retained heat. Maggie got the canvas through her connections in Warnhold. 20 cubits of wax-impregnated canvas. Expensive. But Maggie said it was an investment. Dan didn't know the word in the local language, but he got the gist. The main trick was in the floor. Dan plowed the area for the greenhouse, but not for planting, for heat. He altered the soil structure to a depth of 1 meter, creating a layer of loose soil saturated with compost. Compost releases heat as it decomposes. A biochemical reaction. No magic. Or maybe it was magic, because the plow did to the soil what an ordinary plow couldn't. It changed the structure at the molecular level. It created ideal conditions for thermophilic bacteria. The result? Inside the greenhouse, even in the frost, The temperature didn't drop below 10 degrees, according to Dan's estimation. He didn't have a thermometer. He gauged the temperature by how the water in the watering can behaved. If the steam came out in a thin stream, it meant it was above 5. If it came out in puffs, it meant it was below. A farmer's thermometer. The first snow fell at the beginning of the 10th month. White and heavy. The village fell silent. Smoke from the chimneys. Shutters closed. People were used to spending the winter like animals, huddling in their burrows and waiting for spring. Dan wasn't going to wait. Carrots, radishes, and early spinach were growing in the greenhouse. The watering can provided water at the right temperature. The hoe kept the soil free of fungal infections that, in the warmth and moisture, could kill the seedlings overnight. Every morning, Dan would walk into the greenhouse, and it felt like he was coming home. Warm, humid. It smelled of earth and greenery, just like in his father's greenhouse in January, when it was -20 outside the walls, but inside the tomatoes were blooming. Lena came every day. She recorded the temperature using Dan's system. She measured the plant's growth with a string and a stick. She kept a journal. She was no longer that thin, pale girl whom Dan found on the verge of death. She had grown stronger. Her cheeks had turned rosy. Her arms had grown stronger. She carried buckets of compost without getting out of breath. Dan noticed this out of the corner of his eye and rejoiced quietly, just as he had rejoiced when a sprout broke through the crust of the earth. Sanhua grew quieter in the winter. Fewer creatures came from the forest. The rifts slowed down in the winter, but she didn't stop patrolling. Every night, through blizzards and freezing cold. Dan once stepped out onto the porch at midnight and saw her silhouette at the edge of the field. A black figure against the white snow, motionless as a pillar. He brought her a bowl of hot soup. She took it. She drank it standing up, without removing her gloves from the hilt of her sword. Dan stood beside her. He asked why she went out every night if there were no creatures. Songkwa didn't answer right away. Then she said she couldn't sleep, that when she closed her eyes, she saw them, her own. The mage with his arm torn off. The archer with a hole in his chest. The tank who shielded her with his own body. She sees them every night and can't stop it. That's why she goes out. She stands there. She listens to the silence. Because silence means that everyone here is alive. Everyone is safe. And that's the only thing that helps. Dan was silent. Then he said he'd bake some bread in the morning. Warm bread, with a crust that crunches. He said that bread isn't medicine, but sometimes that's enough. Songkva looked at him in the moonlight. She nodded, finished her soup, returned to her post. Maggie worked harder in the winter than in the summer. Trade didn't slow down. She found a new route along the northern trail, where the snow fell later. She organized a winter caravan to Varnhold. She took salted turnips and dried herbs. She brought back iron, cloth, and a sack of real wheat flour. Dan baked bread from that flour. White, soft, with a golden crust. They'd never seen bread like this in Quiet Creek. He sliced the loaf at the communal dinner and handed a piece to everyone. Old woman Martha took her piece and pressed it to her chest before taking a bite. Bran took his and ate in silence, quickly, without looking. But Dan noticed that he closed his eyes for a second. For just 1 second, that was enough. Illivan blossomed in winter, a paradox. Everyone was freezing and bundled up, but she walked barefoot through the snow, and it seemed as though the snow was melting beneath her footsteps. She wasn't cold, half elven blood. She helped out in the greenhouse. Her presence near the plants did something Dan couldn't explain scientifically. The seedlings next to Illivan grew a third faster. The leaves were brighter. The stems were sturdier. Dan asked what she was doing. Illivan said nothing, just standing there. Dan said that wasn't nothing, that he could see the difference. Illivan was silent for a moment. Then she said that druids don't do, druids allow. The difference is subtle but important. She doesn't force the plants to grow. She allows them to grow. She removes whatever gets in the way. Fear, stress, anxiety. Dan listened and thought it sounded crazy. Plants don't feel fear. But then he remembered that there had been studies on Earth. Plants grew better when exposed to classical music than in silence. No one knew why. Maybe it was the vibrations. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was something science hadn't discovered yet. He decided not to argue. The result was right before his eyes. The spinach in the corner of the greenhouse where Illivan stood most often was twice as thick as the rest. In the second week of winter, the first cold snap arrived, making Dan's cheekbones ache. Dan's body wasn't used to such cold. Or perhaps it was, but not in the way he meant. It was used to enduring, not to living. Dan didn't want to endure. He wanted everyone to be warm. He gathered the people. He proposed rebuilding the houses, not all of them, just the 3 worst ones. To reinforce the walls with clay mixed with straw, to seal the cracks, to install a simple stove in each house, made from stones gathered by the stream. The people listened. Thomas said there weren't enough hands. Everyone was busy just trying to survive. Dan said that was exactly why they needed to build. Because a house that holds in the heat saves firewood, and firewood is time, and time is life. Maggie did the math. It turned out that if they insulated the 3 houses, the village would save 1/3 of its firewood over the winter. 1/3 of the firewood is 6 days' work in the woods, 6 days that could be spent on something else. The people exchanged glances. Brand stood up. He said he knew how to plaster walls with clay, and he knew how to build a stove. If someone provided the stones, he'd do it. Dan looked at him. He nodded. He said there were stones by the stream, lots of them. He nodded to Thomas. He said they needed clay. Thomas nodded. Elsie said she'd provide the straw, and off they went. For 4 days the whole village worked. Everyone. Even the children hauled stones. Even Martha mixed the clay. Bran built the stoves silently and skillfully. His blacksmith's hands knew stone and fire. Dan worked alongside him. He mixed the clay. He hauled straw. He plastered the walls. By the end of the 4th day, 3 houses had been insulated and a new stove was burning in each one. Warm, dry. For the first time in years, the children in these houses slept without 3 blankets. Winter dragged on. Dan counted the days. He counted the supplies. He counted the mouths to feed. 23 people in the village, plus Sankva, plus Maji, plus Ilivin, who ate little but still ate, plus the 2 guards who lived on a nearby farmstead and came for food every week. 28 mouths to feed. According to Lena's calculations, the supplies would last until early spring. Just barely, but they would last. If nothing happened. Something happened. At the end of the 10th month, a blizzard blocked the road to Sari Log. A wagon train carrying wool got stuck halfway there. Sankva and one of the guards went to help. They returned 3 days later. They brought back the wagon train. And they brought back someone else too. 5 refugees from a village Dan didn't know. Progorally common. They were heading west, fleeing from something, or from someone. Gaunt. Frozen. 2 children. An old man with frostbitten fingers. A woman with empty eyes. A man who could only stay on his feet because he was carrying the youngest child in his arms. Dan silently went down to the cellar. He brought out some food. He fed them, gave them water, settled them in the greenhouse where it was warmest. Lena wrapped the children in blankets. Sankva stood in the doorway and said nothing. Maggie counted the supplies and came to Dan. She spoke quietly so no one would hear. If we have 5 more mouths to feed, we won't make it until spring. We're 2 weeks short. Dan nodded. He said he knew. He said he'd go down to the stream tomorrow morning. He'd try planting early maturing radishes under the watering can. If the watering can provided the right kind of water, the radishes would grow in 10 days, even in the frost. Maggie looked at him. She asked, what if it didn't? Dan said that then he'd give up his share. Maggie opened her mouth. She closed it. She turned and walked away. Dan stepped out onto the porch. The frost bit his cheeks. The stars stood sharp and cold. He sat down. He looked at his hands. Thin. Calloused. The hands of a 16-year-old boy who had lived a whole lifetime in 10 months. Tomorrow would be a new day. And radishes. And maybe that would be enough. The radish had grown in 8 days. The watering can provided water that didn't freeze and smelled of spring. Dan harvested it in the darkness at dawn. His fingers wouldn't bend from the cold. But the radish was in his hands. Red, round, crunchy. He brought it into the house where the refugees were sleeping. He sliced it. He put them in bowls. The old man from Burnt Rock took his bowl with trembling hands. He took a bite, chewed. Tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks and froze on his chin. He didn't say a word. He just ate. Dan stood and watched. Then he turned and went into the greenhouse. Half for the winter. The village had survived the winter without any losses. For the first time. 23 people from Quiet Creek, plus 5 refugees, plus Dan's team. Everyone was alive. Everyone was well fed. Everyone had a roof over their heads. When the snow began to melt and the first patches of bare ground appeared in the fields, Dan stood on the hill and looked down. Mud. Gray earth mixed with the remnants of snow. But the green patch of the greenhouse stood out in the middle of the village like a lighthouse. And all around it, the garden beds were slowly coming to life. Life was returning. Dan walked down the hill and went to work. Spring wouldn't wait. Helen Warwick appeared in the third week of spring. She wasn't walking along the road like the others. She was walking across the field, right through the garden beds, stumbling over the furrows. Her hair stuck out in all directions. Round glass lenses in copper frames sat on her nose. A bundle of parchments jutted out from under her arm. A bag hung over her shoulder, from which the corner of a thick book peeked out. She walked, muttering something under her breath without looking where she was stepping. Lena spotted her first and ran to intercept her before she trampled the young seedlings. She made it in time. She stopped the woman 2 steps before the tomato row. Helen looked up. She looked at Lena. She looked at the garden bed. Then she looked at the ground beneath her feet. And she crouched down, right into the furrow. She took a small magnifying glass out of her bag, held it up to the ground, stared at it for a minute. Then she looked up and said it was impossible. The soil's residual magic was 0. A clean 0. Nothing like this exists anywhere in Orvain. Everywhere else, the background mana level in the ground ranges from 20 to 100 units. Here it's 0, as if someone had wiped it all out, down to the very last particle. Helen Warwick, 24 years old, a 4th-level research archmage from the Tower of Arcanus. Specializes in theoretical natural magic. She earned her doctorate at 21, the youngest in the Tower's history. She was sent to study the phenomenon in the village where things that shouldn't grow. The Tower wasn't interested in the harvest. The Tower was interested in the magical mechanism, because if someone had found a way to eliminate the magical residue in the soil, it would change everything magicians knew about the interaction between mana and matter. Helen arrived for 3 days. She stayed for a year and a half. But she didn't know that yet. Dan found her in the greenhouse an hour after arriving. She was sitting on the ground with a magnifying glass and a notebook, sketching the soil's structure at the microscopic level. Parchments were scattered around her. She didn't notice Dan until he crouched down beside her. She looked up. Her glasses had slid down to the tip of her nose. Her hair fell across her face. She blew on them. They fell back into place. She blew again. Dan handed her a small string from his pocket. She looked at the string, then at him. She took it, tied her hair back into a ponytail, said thank you, and went back to her notebook. Dan sat beside her and waited. 10 minutes later, she looked up again, as if she'd just remembered there was someone next to her. She asked who he was. Dan said he was the owner of this greenhouse. Helen looked around. She looked at the plants, at the walls, at the compost floor. Then she said that the greenhouse had been built in violation of all known principles of thermal magic. That heating from the decomposition of organic matter is primitive biochemistry, not a magical construct. That in the tower, they hadn't even considered such an approach. Dan said that in the tower, they probably hadn't tried getting their hands dirty with manure. Helen opened her mouth, closed it. Then she laughed, briefly and unexpectedly, like someone who hadn't laughed in a long time and was surprised by the sound of her own laughter. For the next 3 days, Helen studied everything. The fields, the garden beds, the greenhouse, the tools. She asked Dan to demonstrate each tool in action. He demonstrated. She took notes. She filled 4 sheets of parchment with tiny handwriting. She drew diagrams, formulas, charts. Dan didn't understand a single formula, but he could see that Helen did. And he saw that the more she understood, the more confused she became. On the 3rd evening, she came out to the porch to see him. She sat down. She placed the parchments on her lap. She said she couldn't explain what she was seeing, that the artifacts don't use mana at all. They run on something else, something not found in textbooks. She said that in 3 years at the tower, she'd studied 600 artifacts. All of them ran on mana. All of them obeyed known laws. These 4 don't. They're outside the system. Dan listened. Then he asked if it mattered. Helen looked at him as if he'd asked whether 2 + 2 = 4. Dan clarified. He asked if it changed anything for the garden beds, for people, for food. Helen fell silent. Then she said no. It didn't change anything for the garden beds. Dan nodded. He said that maybe they could discuss the theory tomorrow. But for now, it was time for dinner. She was hungry. He could tell. Helen opened her mouth to object. Her stomach spoke up first, loudly. She blushed. Dan stood up and went to cook. Helen stayed behind. She settled into the corner of the greenhouse that Dan had cleared out for her. She set up a table made of crates there. She laid out the parchments. She'd brought additional lenses and reagents from Warnhold via Maggie. She measured everything: temperature, humidity, magical background, and the growth rate of each plant. The correlation between Illivan's presence and crop yield. Dan gave her full access to everything, not because he trusted the Tower of Arcanus, but because he could see that Helen wasn't a spy. She's a scientist. She doesn't need power over his fields. She needs to understand. That's what he respected. Because he was like that himself. 20 years in the fields and in laboratories. Every experiment driven by a single question. Why? Why does this soil yield more? Why is this variety more resilient? Why do cover crops work exactly this way? Helen asked the same questions. In different words, but the same ones. One morning, Dan found Helen asleep at the table, her head resting on the parchments. Her contact lenses had slipped out. Ink had smudged across her cheek. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She'd forgotten. Dan quietly took the parchments from her. He draped a blanket over her shoulders. He placed a bowl of strawberries next to her. The first strawberries of the season. From the greenhouse. Red, ripe, and smelling of summer. Helen woke up an hour later. She saw the bowl. She picked up a berry, took a bite, closed her eyes. Sat like that for a minute. When she opened her eyes, there was something new in them. Not formulas, not data, just quiet wonder. She found Dan in the field. She stood in front of him. She held the empty bowl. She said that no one had ever told her to just eat strawberries and sleep under an apple tree. Dan said there wasn't an apple tree yet, but there would be. He'd plant one by summer. Helen stood there and looked at him. Then she said quietly that she would stay. Not for the research, for the strawberries. Dan nodded. He said the strawberries needed weeding. If she wanted to help, the gloves were in the box by the entrance. For the first time in her life, Helen put on gardening gloves. They were too big for her. She looked ridiculous. Her contact lenses had slipped out of place. Her hair was sticking out. The gloves were baggy. But she crouched down by the garden bed and began pulling out the weeds. Slowly. Clumsily. With an expression of absolute concentration on her face. As if she were solving a theorem. Dan watched. Then he turned away to his own row. He smiled. Spring was gaining strength. Dan had expanded his cultivated area. Now nearly 3 acres were under cultivation. The main plot by the stream. The north garden bed. The west wedge. Elsie's vegetable garden. The greenhouse. And the new southern plot he'd begun preparing for winter wheat. His first serious grain crop. Not vegetables. Grain. Bread. Maggie had said that if Quiet Creek started producing its own grain, it would change everything. Right now, they bought grain in Warnhold for silver. Their own grain meant their own bread. Our own bread meant freedom. Dan knew that. Wheat was the next step. But wheat is more finicky than potatoes. It needs different soil, a different pH, a different texture. He walked through the southern plot for a week, every day, morning and evening. He collected samples. He sniffed them. He rubbed them between his fingers. He thought. The plow was waiting. But Dan wasn't in a hurry, because he knew. Ignorance equals pain. If he took up the plow without understanding this land, the plow would take his strength. A lot of strength. Maybe more than he could give. He waited until he understood. And by the end of the 4th week of spring, he understood. The southern plot stood on a bed of clay. Beneath 30 centimeters of silt lay a layer of heavy red clay. Water wouldn't drain through it. Roots couldn't break through. He had to break up that layer, create drainage channels 1/2 meter deep, divert the water to the stream. and then work on the topsoil. Dan grabbed the plow. He went out to the plot, and he began. The plow moved with difficulty. The clay resisted, not like dead earth but like living stone. Dan felt the resistance in his hands and in his chest. The plow sapped his strength, little by bit, with every stroke. By the end of the first day, he had plowed a third of the field. He returned home and collapsed onto the straw. He didn't eat. He couldn't. He felt nauseous from exhaustion. Lena brought him water. Sankva stood in the doorway with a stony expression. Elevin placed her hand on his forehead and said that a quarter of his life force had been depleted. Dan nodded. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the second third. It took 3 days to finish the southern plot. 3 days after which Dan couldn't get up. He lay on the straw and stared at the ceiling. His body ached not in his muscles but deeper, in his bones, in his blood. As if someone had taken a part of his life and poured it into the earth. Helen measured his condition with her instruments. She said his bioenergetic level had dropped by 30%. That for an ordinary person, this was the level of a serious illness. That he needed rest. Dan lay there and thought. He thought about how the instruments take their toll, always, and the toll is higher the less he knows the land. The southern plot was new, unfamiliar, clay he couldn't sense. That's why the plow had taken so much. This was important. It was a limitation he had to remember. He couldn't run across the world swinging a plow. Every new field came at a price, and the price rose with the distance from what he already knew. The summer of the first year brought both abundance and danger. The wheat on the southern plot sprouted in 6 weeks, a golden wall up to his waist. The ears were heavy and full. No one in the area had seen grain like this in generations. Dan stood at the edge of the field and counted. By his estimates, the harvest would yield enough flour for Quiet Creek to bake its own bread until the following summer. No purchases, no bartering, their own bread. He looked at Lena, who was standing nearby with a notebook. She was recording the height of the ears of wheat and the sowing density. Dan said they could start threshing by fall. Lena nodded. Then she raised her head and looked east. There was dust on the road, a lot of dust. Not a merchant, not a traveler. Someone was riding fast, and not alone. Duke Valmore's mercenaries arrived at sunset, 12 horsemen, heavy armor, spears with flags. The commander led the way, a tall, gaunt man with a face that had long since forgotten how to smile. He dismounted at the village headman's house and announced the decree of His Grace Duke Conrad Valmore. The village of Quiet Creek and all its lands were to come under the jurisdiction of the duchy. All fields are to be inventoried. All supplies are to be confiscated. A villager named Dane is to report to the Duke for a private conversation, with his tools. Oren stood before the commander, as white as a sheet. His hands were shaking. He had seen people like this before. The last time such men had come to a neighboring village, they had taken half the men away to work on the castle's construction. None of them had returned. Dane stood behind the village headman. Next to him stood Sonva, her hand on her sword. Maggie was counting the horsemen near her house. Helen peered out of the greenhouse, a parchment in her hand. Illivan stood barefoot at the edge of the field, watching the mercenaries with an expression that made the commander feel uneasy, though he didn't understand why. Dan stepped forward. He stood before the commander. He said he'd heard the order. He said he was ready to talk, but not with the commander, but with the Duke himself. The commander smirked. He said peasants don't make demands. Dan didn't argue. He turned to Lena and asked her to bring 3 bowls from the house. Lena nodded and left. Dan looked at the commander. He asked when the commander had last eaten. The commander didn't answer. His stomach did, with a quiet rumble. The 12 horsemen behind him exchanged glances. They'd been riding for 2 days without a hot meal. Lena returned with the bowls. Dan went to the hearth. He reheated yesterday's soup, a thick potato soup with herbs. He sliced some bread, that same soft white bread made from wheat flour. He brought it to the commander. He set the bowls on the table in the courtyard. He sat down across from him. The commander looked at the soup. He looked at the bread. He looked at Dan. Then he sat down, because the smell was stronger than the order. The commander ate in silence. Then he took a second bowl, then some bread. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Dan waited. The commander opened his eyes. He looked at Dan with different eyes. Not as a peasant, as a human being. Dan spoke, calmly, without defiance, without grandstanding. He said that if the Duke took the fields and the supplies, the village would die. 30 people, 7 children. He said that he, Dan, was ready to go to the Duke, but not as a prisoner, as a guest, because he had something to offer. What the Duke wanted was food, food that grows on dead soil. Dan could teach the Duke's people to do the same, not with the artifacts, without them. Just basic agronomy, crop rotation, compost, proper irrigation. In 2 years, the Duke's lands would yield twice as much. No mages, no expenses, just knowledge. The commander listened. Then he asked why Dan didn't just want to obey. Dan answered simply, because if he obeyed, that knowledge would die along with the village. But if he negotiated, the knowledge would spread and feed thousands. The commander was silent. Then he stood up. He said he would pass the message on. He left. 12 horsemen followed him. They took 2 bowls and half a loaf of bread with them. Dan didn't object. The Duke's reply arrived a week later. Not mercenaries. A letter, delivered by a courier on a horse covered in foam. Duke Conrad Valmore invited Dan from Quiet Creek to a private audience at Valmore Castle, with a guarantee of safety, with the right to bring 2 companions. Maggie read the letter 3 times. She said that the Duke's guarantee of safety was worth less than the paper it was written on. Sankva said she would go with him. It wasn't up for discussion. Dan said he would go. Maggie began to object. Dan raised his hand. He said the Duke had 3 provinces, thousands of acres of land, all depleted, all dying. If he could show the Duke that the land was capable of more, it was worth the risk. Maggie fell silent. Then she said she would go as the 3rd companion. Someone has to negotiate. Dan doesn't know how. Sanwa doesn't want to, so it's her. They set out at dawn. Dan took a bag of seeds and 2 turnips. Sanwa took a sword and 3 knives. Maggie took an abacus, a map, and a small pouch of silver for unexpected expenses. Lena stood at the gate and watched them go. Helen stood nearby with her notebook, recording the weather. Ilovin stood barefoot on the greenhouse roof, gazing at the horizon. Dan turned around. He looked at the village, a green patch in the middle of a gray world. He thought that if he didn't return, Lena knew enough to keep the fields alive. Helen knows the theory. Ilovin feels the earth. Maggie runs the farm. Sankva will be there. They'll manage. But he was going to come back. Valmore Castle stood on a hill 3 days' journey away. A massive gray stone structure. Fields lay all around it, the very fields that had fed 3 provinces. Dan looked at them from the road and shook his head. It was worse than he'd thought. The land wasn't just depleted. It was sick. A gray crust covered it like ringworm. Nothing was growing, no weeds, no grass, emptiness. There were fewer creatures from the rifts here than at Quiet Creek. But the land was worse, much worse, as if something were sucking the life out of it from within. Dan climbed down from the wagon. He took a handful of soil, rubbed it between his fingers. He sniffed it and froze. This soil didn't smell like depleted soil. It smelled like it had been poisoned by something heavy, metallic, chemical, not of natural origin. Someone or something had deliberately poisoned this land. Dan looked at the castle. He looked at the fields. He looked at Maggie. He told her the situation was more serious than he'd thought. Maggie asked how much more serious. Dan said this land hadn't just been depleted. It had been killed, intentionally. Maggie turned pale. Duke Conrad Valmore received them in the Great Hall. A tall man of 45, broad shoulders, gray eyes, a neatly trimmed beard, dressed simply for a man of his rank. No gold, no jewelry, only a ring bearing the family crest on his right hand. His face was intelligent and weary. He wasn't a villain. Dan realized this immediately. He was a man who ruled over a dying land and didn't know how to save it. 3 provinces, 200,000 people, and the harvest was falling by 5% every year. In 10 years, famine. In 20, extinction. The Duke knew this. That's why he was looking for Dan, not to take him away, but to understand. The Duke offered terms. Dan would move into the castle. He'd receive land, people, resources. He'd work for the Duke. In exchange, the village would be left in peace. Dan listened. Then he said no. The Duke raised an eyebrow. Dan explained. He said he couldn't leave Quiet Creek. Not because he didn't want to, because his tools only work on the land he knows. To revive the Duke's land, he needs to live on it. For years. And his land in Quiet Creek will die without him during that time. Instead, Dan proposed something else. He'll teach the Duke's people. He'll send students. He'll create manuals so that any farmer can begin to restore the land. Not as quickly as with the artifacts. More slowly, but surely. The Duke listened. He was silent. Then he asked why Dan was doing this. What he stood to gain. Dan said he would gain peace. If the Duke's land began to feed his people, the Duke wouldn't need to take from others. And if it didn't feed them, the Duke would come again. And a third time. And a 10th time. Until he takes it all. The only way to protect Quiet Creek is to ensure that the Duke no longer needs it. The Duke looked at Dan. For a long time. Then he said that for the first time, a peasant had explained geopolitics to him better than his advisors. Maggie coughed. She added that the proposal included a trade agreement for the supply of and educational materials, at a fair price. The Duke looked at Maggie, at the abacus in her hands, at her stern face. He nodded. He said they would discuss the details in the morning. But for now, it was time for dinner. Dan didn't cook at the castle. It wasn't his kitchen. But he'd brought 2 turnips with him, and he asked the castle cook to simply boil them. No additives, no spices, just in water. The cook looked at him as if he were a fool, but he boiled them. At dinner, the Duke tasted the turnip. He set down his spoon. He looked at his plate, then at Dan. He asked what it was. Dan said it was a turnip. The Duke said he'd been eating turnips his whole life. This wasn't a turnip. Dan said that this was indeed a turnip, just the real thing, grown in living soil. The kind of flavor everyone has forgotten and thinks never existed. The Duke ate in silence. He finished. He leaned back in his chair. He was silent for a long time. Then he said one word. It's a deal. Maggie took out a parchment. By midnight, the agreement was ready. Quiet Creek was granted the status of a free village under the Duke's protection. In exchange, Dan agreed to send 3 apprentices to the lands of Valmore and to supply seeds at a fixed price. Maggie affixed the seal of the Ashford Trading House, which technically didn't exist, but the Duke didn't check. On the way back, Dan was silent the entire first day. On the second day, Maggie asked what he was thinking about. Dan said he was thinking about the Duke's land, about how it was poisoned. Not depleted, poisoned. By someone. Maggie asked who. Dan shook his head. He said he didn't know, but he was going to find out. Because if someone was deliberately poisoning Orway's land, then everything he was doing in Quiet Creek was just a bandage on a wound from which the knife hadn't been removed. Sonva listened in silence, her hand on her sword. She already knew that peace lay ahead. War lay ahead. Just not the kind of war she was used to. The second year began with school. Dan didn't build a structure. He set up a shelter made of logs and canvas next to the greenhouse. Under the shelter was a long table. On the table were pots filled with soil, different kinds. Clay from the southern plot, sand from the road, black soil from the plot by the stream, silt from the riverbank. 10 samples from 10 locations, each in a separate pot, labeled by Lena's hand. The first students arrived from Greylog and Bear's Corner. 6 of them, 3 men and 3 women, all nameless, all hungry. They all looked at Dan the way people look at someone who can do the impossible. Dan sat them down at the table. He placed a pot in front of each of them. He said the first lesson was simple. Touch it, smell it, rub it between your fingers, say what you feel. They looked at him as if he were crazy. Then they began to touch it. An hour later, each of them could tell the difference between clay and loam by touch. After 2 hours, they could determine acidity by smell. After 3 hours, Dan realized that one of his students, a boy named Rice from Bear's Corner, could sense the earth almost as well as he could. Rice didn't know the word nitrogen fixation, but he knew that peas grow better if barley had been grown in the same spot before them. He'd learned that from his grandfather. His grandfather didn't know why. He just knew. Dan looked at Rice and saw himself at 16 on his father's farm, when everything seemed simple. When the soil was just soil, not a subject of research. He told Rice that he would be the senior student. Rice blushed to the tips of his ears. Helen helped with the theory. She couldn't explain the magic of the artifacts, but she could explain the basics of natural magic, which correlated with what Dan called agrochemistry. Local mages used the concept of earth mana. Dan used the concept of fertility. Helen discovered that they were one and the same. Earth mana was what Dan called the biological activity of the soil. Microorganisms, mycorrhizal networks, root symbioses. The local mages measured this with magical instruments and called it mana. Dan measured it with his hands and nose and called it fertility. Different languages. One subject. Helen wrote the first textbook, a slim, 20-page notebook, half in the language of the Tower of Arcanus, half in Dan's language. Simple drawings, crop rotation diagrams, a composting chart, signs of nutrient deficiencies based on leaf color. Dan checked every page. He corrected 3 mistakes. Helen took offense. Then she checked it herself and agreed. Eleven taught separate lessons. She taught them to listen, not to the earth, but to everything around them. The wind, water, trees. She said that Dan's agronomy was a language, and a druid's intuition was hearing. A language without hearing is dead. Hearing without language is useless. Together they provide understanding. Dan didn't argue. He saw the results. The students who took Ilevin's lessons could assess soil conditions faster than those who studied only from Helen's charts. They sensed things they couldn't name, and Dan gave them names. By the middle of the second year, the school was up and running. 10 students, 6 from the first class and 4 new ones. 3 went back to their villages. Rice left for Greylog and sent a message a month later via Maggie's trade caravan. The peas had sprouted. The harvest was 3 times larger than last year's, without the tools. Just with ordinary hands and ordinary knowledge. Dan read the note and put it in his pocket. He carried it for 3 days. Then he gave it to Lena for the archives. Lena asked why he'd carried the note for 3 days. Dan said he'd simply forgotten. Lena looked at him and said nothing. She knew he hadn't forgotten. At the end of the summer of the second year, the high priest of the Temple of the Harvest sent an inquisitor. Sister Anna Hawthorne arrived on a white horse, dressed in full temple regalia. A white robe, the silver symbol of the goddess on her chest, a consecrated sword at her belt. 2 novices rode behind her carrying torches. She rode into the village as if entering a heretical den, with fire in her eyes and a command in her heart. Burn the fields, confiscate the tools, arrest the nameless one named Dane and bring him to the capital for trial. Dead or alive. Preferably alive. But if that doesn't work out, dead is also acceptable. She dismounted at the central square. There was no square, just a courtyard between the houses. But Anna stood in the middle anyway and announced the verdict in a voice that rolled over the village like thunder. People came out of their houses, quietly, fearfully. Children hid behind their mothers. Thomas stood with an axe. Bran stood by the forge with a hammer. Sonva stood with a sword. Maggie was counting the novices. Helen was holding a notebook. Ilevin stood on the greenhouse roof and looked at Anna with an expression Dan couldn't read. Dan came out of the greenhouse. His hands were covered in dirt. His pants were muddy. A towel was draped over his shoulder. He looked at Anna, at the white horse, at the torches, at the consecrated sword. Then he turned toward the house. He called out to Lena to put the water on. Then he turned back to Anna. He said she was right on time. Dinner in an hour. Anna fell silent. Not because she didn't know what to say. It was because in her 26 years living in the temple, no one had ever responded to an inquisitor's verdict with an invitation to dinner. Dan cooked for an hour and a half. Anna stood in the courtyard with her sentence and didn't know what to do. The novices shifted from foot to foot. Sonva stood opposite them with such a look on her face that they didn't dare move. Dan carried the food out to the table in the courtyard. Braised chicken with herbs from his garden. Rosemary, thyme, sage, basil. The bird had simmered for 4 hours over low heat with carrots, garlic, and a drop of honey. The meat fell off the bones. The aroma was so strong that Anna's white horse turned its head and whinnied. Dan placed a bowl in front of Anna. She looked at the food, at the steam rising from the bowl, at the golden chicken skin glistening with juices, at the green herbs. She hadn't eaten a home-cooked meal since she was 4. ever since the temple had taken her from the orphanage. At the temple they were fed, good, filling, proper, but without love. Food at the temple was fuel, a formula. So much protein, so many carbohydrates, so many vitamins, if the locals even knew that word. This bowl was different. This bowl smelled like a home she'd never had. Anna sat down. She picked up a spoon. Her hand was shaking. She brought the spoon to her mouth. She tasted it and froze. Something inside her shifted. Not faith, not duty. Something deeper. Something she'd buried at age 4 when she stopped crying at night because no one ever came anyway. She ate in silence. Dan sat across from her, eating his portion. He didn't look at her. He gave her space. When Anna finished eating, Dan took the bowl away. He returned with a new one, a different dish, turnips baked with goat cheese and walnuts. Anna looked at the second bowl, then at Dan. He said he'd noticed she didn't eat boiled onions. In the first bowl, the onions were braised, not boiled. Anna dropped her spoon. She stared at the table. For a long time, someone noticed. Someone paid attention. Someone remembered that she didn't like it. That doesn't happen. Not to her. She picked up her spoon. She ate from the second bowl more slowly. Dan cleared the table. He came back. He sat down. He said that if she wanted to burn his fields, he wouldn't resist, but he asked to take a look first, just to see what he'd done. Anna was silent. Then she nodded. Dan took Anna around the village for 3 days. He showed her everything. The plot by the stream where turnips had saved the village headman's daughter. Thomas's field where crop rotation had tripled the harvest. Elsie's garden where spinach and sorrel fed 4 children. The compost-heated greenhouse. The south-facing plot with wheat. The school under the canopy. The pollinator strip where Illivan's silvergrass shimmered alongside wild grasses. The garden beds in neighboring yards. The barter network on Maggie's map. Lena's records from the past year and a half. Every field. Every crop. Every result. Anna walked in silence. She listened. She watched. She touched the wheat ears. She leaned over the garden beds. She scooped up soil in her hands, just as Dan had taught his students. She rubbed it between her fingers. She sniffed it. Not because she understood, because that's what he did, and she was trying to figure out why. On the 3rd day, she stood in the middle of the plot by the stream and looked at the green rows. All around was gray, lifeless earth. Here was life. The boundary ran along the line that Dan had tilled. Clear-cut, without transition, like the border between 2 worlds. Anna turned to him. She asked how he knew all this. Dan thought for a moment. Then he told the truth. Not all of it, but enough. He said that the knowledge had come to him along with the tools, that he was neither a mage nor a priest, that he simply understood the earth, how it worked, what it needed, what kills her. Anna asked about the goddess. Had he given her the class without performing the ritual? Was he using forbidden power? Dan shook his head. He said the goddess was silent. She had always been silent. He was the nameless one. No class, no mana, no blessing. All he has are his hands and his head, and 4 tools that respond to the one who understands. Anna was silent. Then she said that according to the law of the temple, this was impossible. That without the goddess's blessing, nothing could grow like that. That if it wasn't a gift from the goddess, then it must be a gift from her enemy. Dan listened. Then he said there was a 3rd option, that it wasn't a gift at all, that it was simply knowledge. The same kind of knowledge a blacksmith has about metal, or a healer has about herbs. Only deeper, only broader, only about the earth. Anna looked at him. Then she said quietly that she wanted to stay. Just 1 more day. Dan nodded. A day turned into a week. A week turned into a month. Anna didn't take off her robe. She didn't renounce the temple, but she didn't burn the fields either. She lived in an empty house that Maggie had renovated in 2 days. Every morning she went out in her white robes. Every morning she walked to the fields. She stood at the edge. She looked. Then she returned. She wrote long letters on parchment. She sealed them. She stacked them in a pile. She didn't send them. Dan didn't ask who they were for. Sonva asked why the Inquisitor was living nearby. Dan said that Anna was searching for something. Sonva asked what exactly. Dan replied, the truth. Sonva snorted. She said that the truth was food on the table and a roof over one's head, not sealed parchments. Dan didn't argue. In mid-fall of the 2nd year, Anna came to see Dan one evening. He was sitting on the porch, peeling carrots for the morning soup. Anna sat down next to him. She was silent for 10 minutes. Then she said that the temple was lying. She said it in an even voice, as if reading a report. Dan stopped peeling. He looked at her. Anna continued. She said that the instruments she had seen were not artifacts of dark magic, nor were they a gift from the goddess in the usual sense. They were older than the temple, older than the rite of betrothal, older than anything the temple considered sacred. She said that in the temple's archives there was a record shown only to the highest-ranking inquisitors, a record of the schism, of how 800 years ago the goddess did not depart. Instead, she split herself apart, voluntarily. She cut herself into 4 parts and became tools, so she could remain with the people after the other gods had departed. The temple is built on the story of the goddess's departure, on her will and her wrath, on the rituals needed to earn her gift. It's all a lie. The goddess didn't leave. The goddess is here, in the hoe, in the sickle, in the watering can, in the plow. Dan sat there. A carrot lay on his lap, a knife in his hand. He listened and felt something shift inside him. Not surprise. Recognition. Like when you've been searching for an answer for a long time and suddenly see it and realize you've always known. He looked at the hoe leaning against the wall. Warm. Familiar. Not a tool. Part of something alive. He'd always felt it. From the very first day. The warmth in his palms. The ease of the work. The feeling that the hoe wasn't just a tool but a companion. Now he knew why. Anna continued. She said that the temple had been searching for the tools for 800 years. Not to return them, to destroy them. Because if people learn the truth, the temple will collapse. Its power, its taxes, its monopoly on classes and blessings, everything is built on a lie. If the goddess hasn't left, then the rite of naming isn't necessary. That means the classes can be obtained another way. That means the nameless aren't rejected by the goddess. That means the entire order that holds the kingdom together is a fiction. Dan was silent. Then he asked why she was telling him this. Anna looked at her hands. She said she didn't know. She said she'd come here to burn the fields and take the weapons. But instead, she was eating stewed chicken, sitting on the porch, and talking to a nameless boy about things for which she'd be hanged. Dan picked up a carrot. He kept peeling it. He said he wasn't going to tear down the temple. He wasn't going to shout the truth in the town squares. He wasn't going to lead a rebellion. He wanted only one thing: for the land to live, for people to eat. Everything else would fall into place. Anna looked at him. Then she said quietly that he didn't understand. That the artifacts weren't just tools. That they were looking for someone who could put them back together. And when that happened, the goddess would return, or be reborn. Through him. Dan stopped cleaning. He looked at Anna, then at the hoe against the wall, then at his hands. A farmer's hands, thin and calloused. Hands through which a god might return. He sat there in silence. Carrot peels fell onto the steps. The wind carried the scent of the fields. Somewhere in the greenhouse, Helen was muttering incantations. Somewhere by the fence, Sankva was sharpening her sword. Somewhere, Illivan was singing a quiet song to the trees. Somewhere, Lena was counting sacks. Somewhere, Maggie was checking the wagon train. And Dan sat on the porch with a knife and a carrot, thinking that he hadn't asked to be a vessel for the goddess. He'd only asked to grow a good turnip. But the world, as usual, had other plans. Winter of the second year struck early and hard. Snow fell at the beginning of the 10th month and didn't melt. The frosts were so severe that the water in the stream was covered with a crust of ice as thick as a palm. Dan maintained the greenhouse. He heated it with compost and firewood. The watering can provided water that didn't freeze. The hoe cleared the soil of fungal infections. The village carried on. Supplies were ample. Maggie's barter network ran like clockwork. A winter caravan set out for Warnhold once every 3 weeks and returned with supplies. The school's students had scattered to the villages and were sending back reports. Rice from Greylog wrote that their winter rye crop had survived the first frosts. For the first time in 10 years, the village of Crooked Birch had not lost a single child to starvation. The alliance of villages grew. 8 settlements, then 12, then 15. Each received seeds and knowledge from Quiet Stream. Each paid with what it had: wool, clay, firewood, iron, honey, skills. The network didn't demand silver. The network demanded trust. And that trust rested on one thing: the fact that Dan had never once deceived anyone. The refugees arrived at the end of winter. Not 5 as last time, 30. from 3 villages to the south that Duke Valmore had burned. Dan learned of this from Maggie, who had heard it from a courier. The Duke had broken the agreement, not because he wanted to, because the high priest had pressured him. The temple demanded that the Duke destroy the villages that received seeds from Quiet Creek, to root out heresy completely. The Duke resisted, but the temple threatened excommunication. Without the temple's blessing, the Duke couldn't collect taxes. Without taxes, his army would have disbanded within a month. The Duke made his choice. He sent his troops south. 3 villages burned for one night. 30 people made it to Quiet Creek. Children, the elderly, women, men with burns and wounds. They walked through the snow for 4 days. 7 did not make it. Dan stood at the gate and watched the column. Silently. Lena was beside him. Behind her was Sankva. Behind Sankva was the whole village. 30 mouths to feed. In winter, when supplies were stretched to the limit. Maggie stood there, pale, counting in her head. Dan didn't ask her for the result. He knew. There wouldn't be enough. He turned toward the house. He went down to the cellar. Silently. He carried everything out. Every sack. Every jar. Every bundle of dried herbs. Every bundle of smoked meat. He set them by the gate. He turned toward the village. He said one thing. Take what you can. Orrin carried out a sack of flour. Thomas brought some dried venison. Elsie carried out a pot of salted sorrel. Bran stood by the forge and watched. Then he went inside. He returned with a sack of barley groats. He set it down silently. He left. Even Bran. Dan stood by the hearth and cooked for 6 hours. Just like last winter with the 5 refugees. Only now there were 30 of them. The pot boiled non-stop. Soup made from whatever they had. Thick, hot, and heavy. Bread made from the last of the flour. Barley porridge. Sonva stood guard. Maggie assigned people to their homes. Helen bandaged the wounded. Illivan sat with the children and sang softly. Anna stood in the corner in a white robe and watched. Then she took off the robe, rolled it up, placed it on the bench, rolled up her sleeves. She walked over to Dan. She said she knew how to chop vegetables. Dan gave her a knife and a carrot. They stood side by the hearth and chopped in silence. By nightfall, everyone had been fed. 30 refugees were sleeping in the warmth, in the houses, in the greenhouse, and in the school shed, which they had insulated in 2 hours by working together. Dan sat on the porch with an empty bowl of porridge, the last serving, his own. Lena came over. She sat down next to him. She put a carrot in the bowl, her last one, without a word. Dan looked at the carrot. He looked at Lena. He nodded. He took a bite. He chewed. It dripped down his cheek. He said the carrots were good this year. Sweet. Lena silently rested her head on his shoulder. They sat on the porch. Snow was falling. The world was cold and cruel. But it was warm on the porch. The next morning, Dan gathered everyone, the villagers and the refugees. He said they had 3 weeks' worth of supplies left, that they needed to hold out until spring, that he knew how, that everyone would be given a task. Some would chop wood. Some would fish in the stream under the ice. Some would help in the greenhouse. Some would repair houses. Work for everyone. Food for everyone. Equally. No exceptions. A man from among the refugees stood up, tall, with a sun-scorched face. He asked why. Why was Dan helping them? They were strangers to him. They were from other villages. They have nothing. They're a burden. Dan looked at him, then at his hands. He said he could see calluses. He asked what he used to do. The man said he used to be a carpenter. Dan nodded. He said he needed a storage shed, a new one, a big one, by spring. Could he do it? The man looked at his hands, then at Dan. Then he nodded. Dan turned to the next one. Spring of the 3rd year arrived with warmth and war. The 20 villages of the Union of Green Villages were self-sufficient. For the first time in generations, crops were thriving, children weren't dying. Taxes were paid to the crown not out of fear, but out of calculation. Maggie had built a trade network that operated without silver and without middlemen. Each village produced what it was best at. Exchanges took place through 5 hub locations. Quiet Brook was the center. The school graduated 30 students. They scattered throughout the eastern edge of the kingdom. They carried knowledge, crop rotation, compost, drainage, crop selection. Simple things. Not magic. Science. And the land responded, slowly, with difficulty, but it responded. The temple responded as well. The high priest declared Quiet Creek a hotbed of heresy, formally, with a seal and parchment and a liturgy of excommunication read aloud in every temple in the kingdom. Anyone who trades with heretics is subject to excommunication. Anyone who accepts their seeds is subject to trial. Anyone who learns from the Nameless One is subject to punishment. The word heresy fell upon the Union like a stone into a pond. Waves rippled out in circles. 3 villages left the Union within a week. 2 more were wavering. Maggie rushed over to Dan, white with rage. She said the trade routes were closing, that Varnhold was refusing to supply goods, that caravans were no longer heading east. The temple had cut off the oxygen supply. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he said that the temple couldn't cut off the land. The land doesn't obey parchments. And people who have tasted real food won't forget its flavor. Maggie said that people will forget anything if you scare them enough. Dan agreed, but he said there was a way the temple wasn't expecting. Dan announced his plan at the village council meeting. He would travel to the capital, not to fight, but to provide food. There are 500,000 people in Arkaren. 3/4 live in the lower districts, poor neighborhoods where food costs a day's wages and consists of rotten grain and sour milk. These people go hungry every day. The temple feeds them with promises. Dan will feed them turnips. The council was silent. Then everyone spoke at once. Sonva said it was suicide. Maggie said it was financially impossible. Helen said it was irrational. Illivan said it was beautiful. Anna said it would work. Everyone looked at Anna. She stood there without her robe, wearing a simple dress that Elsie had given her. She said that the temple controls the upper city, the rich, the nobility, the mages, knights. The temple doesn't control the lower city because it has no use for the lower city. There's nothing to take there. But if Dan comes and feeds those whom the temple considers trash, it will be more powerful than any sermon. Because a hungry person who's been fed never forgets who fed them. Dan nodded. He said that was exactly right. The preparations took a month. Maggie organized a convoy. Not just 1, 5, 20 carts, each loaded with sacks of vegetables, grain, and flour. From 20 villages in the Union. Each village gave what it could. Potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, barley, peas, and wheat flour from Quiet Creek, honey, salted meat, dried herbs. 20 wagons of food, enough to feed the lower districts of Arkaren for a week, maybe 2. Sankva assembled a guard. 12 fighters made up of former guards and hunters, not an army, but enough to protect the convoy. Helen wrote leaflets. Simple. No propaganda, just facts. What crop rotation is, how to compost, what to plant in the fall so the earth would come alive in the spring. Ilavan blessed each wagon. She placed her palms on the sacks and whispered. Dan didn't know what she was saying, but the grain in the sack seemed warmer after her touch. Anna wrote a letter to the high priest, an open letter, signed with her name. Inquisitor Sister Anna Hawthorne, apostate, traitor to the temple. In the letter she wrote one thing, that the goddess had not left, that the goddess is here, in the earth, in the grain, in the hands of those who plant and grow, and that the temple standing between the goddess and the people is not a temple but a prison. She knew she would be executed for this letter. She wrote it anyway. The caravan set out at dawn, 20 wagons, a 5-day journey to the capital. Dan sat on the first wagon. They entered Arkaren through the lower gate. The guards did not stop them. Not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. 1,000 people followed the convoy, silent, unarmed. But 1,000. The guard looked at the captain. The captain looked at the crowd, at the wagons, at the sacks, at the boy with a hoe on the first wagon, at the crown knight standing nearby. The captain stepped back. The gates opened. The lower city smelled just as Dan had expected, of rot and urine and smoke and something Swedish that he recognized. The smell of hunger. Hunger has a smell. Those who haven't gone hungry don't know. But Dan knew. Dane's memory knew. Narrow streets, houses standing so close together that their roofs almost touched, ditches along the roads, children with swollen bellies sitting on doorsteps, women with gray faces, men with empty eyes. Dan had looked and saw Quiet Creek a year ago, only 100 times worse, 100 times more hopeless. He stopped the wagon in the square by the dry fountain. He jumped down from the wagon. He stuck a hoe into the ground. He stood next to it. And he began to do what he did best: cook. Sunhwa and the fighters unloaded the sacks. Maggie directed the distribution. Helen handed out leaflets. Illivan stood by the fountain and whispering something. A minute later, water began to flow from the fountain's stone spout. At first a thin trickle, then a thicker stream. Clear, cold. The people in the square froze. Then someone ran up with a bucket, followed by a second, a third. Anna stood off to the side, looking at the temple on the hill. White, distant. She knew they were already watching from there. Lena stood next to Dan. He put the pot on the fire. A large one, made of copper. Borrowed from the blacksmith in the market square for 2 sacks of potatoes. He filled it with water from the fountain. He tossed in the potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, garlic, herbs, salt. He cooked as he always did, calmly, slowly, paying attention to every ingredient. The soup came to a boil an hour later. The aroma wafted through the streets of the lower city, thick, heavy, and enveloping. People began to arrive, first one by one, then in groups, then in a crowd. Dan ladled out the soup, bowl after bowl, mug after mug. For those who didn't have bowls, he poured it into their palms. People drank the hot soup from their palms while kneeling by the dry fountain, which was flowing again. The children ate in silence. They didn't fight. They didn't cry. They just ate, with their eyes closed. Just like that child in Grey Log a year ago. Dan had been cooking all day. 2 cauldrons. 3. 4. Peasants from the union helped out. They peeled vegetables, sliced bread, passed around the bowls. By evening, the square was full. Hundreds of people. They sat on the ground and ate, silently, quietly, without shouting or pushing. They just ate, and they watched the boy with the hoe who stood by the cauldron, ladling out the soup. Not a priest, not a knight, not a mage. Nameless. A farmer. Dan cooked and thought. He thought about cover crops, about how the square before him was paved with stone, but there were cracks between the stones. And in the cracks was soil, dead, gray, like everywhere else. But soil. And if you remove the stones and give it air and light and seeds, it will turn green. He thought about this as he stood by the cauldron in the kingdom's capital, surrounded by 1,000 hungry people and 1,000 peasants who had come for him, and the 6 women who had become his family. He thought about the earth, because the earth is the only thing that never betrays you. On the second day, the king arrived, not with an army, with 3 advisors and his personal guard. King Arkaran was young, 30 years old, pale and nervous. He didn't know what to do with the 1,000 peasants in the lower city square. The high priest demanded they be dispersed. Duke Valmore, standing behind the king, advised an attack. But Sir Galen Rock, a former knight of the crown, stepped before the king and said that if the crown attacked unarmed people who were feeding the hungry, the crown would not be worth the metal from which it was made. The king looked out at the square, at the people who were eating, at the children with clean faces, at the women who were smiling for the first time in months, at the old man who was weeping over a bowl of soup, at the boy by the cauldron. The king dismounted. He approached Dan. The guards flinched. Galen stopped them with a gesture. The king stood before Dan. He looked at the hoe stuck in the ground, at the cauldron of soup, at the line of people with bowls. He asked who he was. Dan said he was a farmer, nameless, from the village of Quiet Creek. The king asked what he wanted. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said he wanted to be left alone, him, his village, and all the villages that feed themselves. He wanted the temple to stop burning fields and persecuting those who teach people how to grow food. He wanted the nameless to stop being buried at the edge of the field as fertilizer. He wanted the land to matter. Not the sword, not manna, not a blessing. The land. The king listened. Then he asked a question, and that was it. Dan nodded. And that was it. The king was silent. Then he turned to his advisors. They began whispering. Dan wasn't listening. He was serving soup. The line seemed endless. Duke Valmore stood at the edge of the square and watched. Dan saw him. Tall, upright, in an expensive cloak. His face was stony. He had come here for another purpose. He had come to watch a peasant being arrested. But the peasant wasn't being arrested. The peasant was feeding the people, and the people were eating, and the guards were standing there, wanting to eat too. Dan saw that Galen had approached the Duke. He was speaking quietly. The Duke was listening. Then his expression changed. It didn't soften, but something shifted within him. Galen stepped away. The Duke stood and watched. Dan wiped his hands. He took an apple from his bag. He walked across the square toward the Duke. Sonva followed him. Dan shook his head. He walked on alone. He stopped in front of Duke Conrad Valmore. He held out the apple. He said it was his own variety, a heirloom, revived from 3 withered cuttings from the neglected garden of the Valmore estate. The land remembers who it belonged to, only it's no longer waiting. The Duke looked at the apple, red, with a golden streak, small, like the ones that grew in his mother's garden when he was a boy and the world hadn't yet turned gray. He took the apple, took a bite. He chewed slowly. Juice ran down his chin. He stood there chewing, and his face, which for 30 years had shown nothing but power and calculation, broke. Not from a blow, from the taste. From the apple that remembered his mother. The Duke sank to his knees. Not before Dan, before the ground. Before the square where 1,000 people were eating soup made from vegetables grown on land everyone had considered dead. Dan stood beside him. He didn't gloat. He didn't look down on him. He just stood there, the way one stands beside a person who is in pain. The king returned an hour later, with a parchment, with a seal, a decree. The village of Quiet Stream and all settlements of the Union of Green Villages are granted the status of free communities under the protection of the Crown. The temple is stripped of the right to prosecute for agronomic activities. The nameless are granted the right to own land. The tax is reduced from 7/10 to 3/10 of the harvest. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he asked if he could add one more point. The king raised an eyebrow. Dan said he wanted the nameless to no longer be buried at the edge of the field. He wanted them to be given a funeral service in the temple, just like everyone else. The king looked at the high priest, who stood white with rage at the steps of the temple on the hill. Then he looked at Dan. Then he nodded. It was recorded. That evening, Dan sat on the steps of the dry fountain. The square was emptying. People were dispersing, full, quiet. The cauldron was empty. The sacks were empty. The carts were empty. Dan looked up at the sky. The stars were lighting up one by one. Alien, unfamiliar, but he was used to it. Lena approached. She sat down next to him. She rested her head on his shoulder, just like that winter on the porch. Sankva walked over. She stood next to them. She folded her arms. Maggie sat down on the other side. She took out her abacus. She twirled it in her hands. She put it away. She just sat there. Helen walked over. She crouched down. She adjusted her contact lenses. She looked at the stars. She muttered something about spectral composition. Illivan stood by the fountain, which was still flowing. Her bare feet were in the water. Her eyes were closed. She was smiling. Anna was the last to approach. She stood slightly to the side. As always. Dan looked at her. He moved over. She sat down. They sat together. All 7 of them. On the steps of the fountain in the capital of the kingdom that, 3 days ago, had wanted to destroy them. Dan took a carrot out of his pocket. The last one. From the first batch. That very one. From the plot by the stream. He broke it into 7 pieces. He handed them out. 1 piece for each of them. They ate the carrots and looked at the stars. Sankva said the carrots were good. Maggie said that at the current exchange rate, this carrot was worth about 1/4 of a silver coin. Helen said its carotene content was abnormally high. Illivan said the carrot was happy. Anna said the carrot was blessed. Lena didn't say anything. She just chewed. Dan watched them. At the 6 women who had become his home. Each had arrived broken, lonely, lost. Each had found a place here, not because he was great, but because he cooked for them, grew things for them, noticed that they didn't like boiled onions, gave them ribbons for their hair, left wild strips of land for pollinators. He simply did specific things for specific people, and that turned out to be stronger than magic. Dan looked at the hoe standing stuck in the ground nearby, warm, quiet. He knew now that a part of the goddess was in it, that the goddess was waiting, that one day he would have to decide, to gather the instruments together and let her return, or to remain Dan, a farmer, a human, with calluses and dirt under his fingernails, and 6 women on the steps of the fountain. He placed his hand on the handle of the hoe. It responded with warmth. Dan closed his eyes. He said quietly that he'd deal with this later, that right now he needed to go home. He needed to check the wheat on the southern plot. He needed to repair the greenhouse roof after winter. He needed to prepare seeds for the new villages that would join the union. He needed to finish the textbook with Helen. He needed to plant the apple tree he'd promised Helen. He needed to teach Anna how to make soup without boiled onions. There was so much to do. But first, home. To Quiet Creek. To his 3 acres. To his stream. To his land that remembered his footsteps. He opened his eyes. He looked at the hoe. He spoke softly, addressing it or whatever was inside it. He said he was doing this for them, not for her. Understood. The hoe pulsed warmly in his hand, as if something inside it had smiled. For the first time in 800 years. The next morning, the wagon train turned toward home. 20 empty wagons, 1,000 peasants, 6 women, 1 farmer with a hoe. They traveled for 3 days. On the 4th day, a hill came into view, and on the hill, a green spot, small, bright, in the middle of a gray world, Quiet Creek. Dan climbed down from the wagon. He stood on the ground, his ground, which knew his footsteps, which remembered his every touch. He bent down, took a handful, rubbed it between his fingers, smelled it, alive, warm, real. He straightened up. He looked at the village, at the fields, at the greenhouse, at the school, at the houses with smoke rising from their chimneys, at Lena, who was running toward him with a notebook, at Sonhua, who was already heading toward the perimeter, at Maggie, who was counting the empty carts and estimating the cost of the expedition, at Helen, who was muttering formulas, at Ilivin, who was standing barefoot on the greenhouse roof and gazing at the horizon, at Anna, who was smiling for the first time without hiding it. Dan walked toward the field. He took out a hoe. He thrust it into the ground. He filled his lungs with air. The air smelled of spring and damp earth, and smoke from the chimneys, and something sweet from the greenhouse. He looked at the horizon, gray, distant. Between him and that horizon lay dying land, thousands of acres, millions, land that could be saved, not with a sword, not with magic, not with a revolution, with a hoe, and patience, and knowledge, and people willing to learn. Dan sat down on the porch, in the evening, after a day's work, dirty, tired, happy. Lena brought out a bowl of soup, hot, potato soup, from his own field. He took the bowl, took a sip. He looked at her, said it was good soup. She smiled, said she'd learned how to make it. Dan took another sip. He looked out at the fields in the sunset light, at the golden wheat, at the green vegetable beds, at the silvery silver grass along the fence, at the bees above the wild strip of land, at the dark line of the forest in the distance, from which the creatures no longer emerged every week, at the paths between the houses, at the smoke from the chimneys, at the children running around the yard and laughing. He looked at his hands, dirty, calloused. A farmer's hands, hands through which the goddess might one day return. Or maybe not, because perhaps she has already returned. Not through him, through the land he brought back to life, through the people he fed, through the grain they sowed with their own hands. Maybe the goddess isn't a being who descends from the heavens. Maybe the goddess is the harvest in a barren field, and the child eating a carrot with his eyes closed, and the old man weeping over a bowl of soup. Dan finished his soup. He set the bowl down on the step. He leaned back against the porch post. He closed his eyes. The wind carried the scent of the fields. Warm, alive, real, he said quietly, so quietly that only the wind heard him. There. Now it's okay.